Good morning. Welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Lauren Reese. I lead our Environmental Change and Security program, which is housed under the Wilson Center's Global Risk and Resilience program. It's really a pleasure to see you all here today. This is an event that we've been looking forward to for some time, and I want to start by thanking our amazing collaborators and partners who have made it possible, specifically USAID, and in particular Cynthia Brady, who is our partner on our Resilience for Peace project. I also want to thank WWF and especially Sarah Davidson for her collaboration. In just a moment, I'll introduce the Wilson Center's president and CEO, Jane Harmon. This fall, the Wilson Center is celebrating our 50th anniversary as a living memorial to President Wilson. That's 50 years of providing a nonpartisan space in Washington, D.C. to bring together the worlds of policy, practice, and research. ECSP has been working at this intersection, bringing together communities from the environment, security, and health sectors at this intersection of policy, practice, and research for about 25 of those years. We are honored to be part of an institution whose programs represent expertise across the globe and on a diverse and critical set of foreign policy issues that run the gamut across the programs. There are 9 other Wilson Center programs co-sponsoring today's event, which I think might be some kind of record and also speaks to the importance of the issue. Many of my colleagues will be available throughout the day if you have any questions or needs, and I encourage you to check out the materials that we have outside in the atrium. I also want to take a minute to thank my colleague Amanda King. Where are you, Amanda? Who has been really instrumental in pulling together today. She started with us this summer and got thrown immediately into the deep end with planning. No pun intended, no. So the speakers you will hear from today are part of a long legacy of convening, of analysis, of better understanding and elevating the connections between water conflict and cooperation here at the Wilson Center. Some of them, like Ken Konka, Richard Matthew, Sherry Goodman, and Aaron Wolf, have been coming here since the first days of the Wilson Center's engagement on water and security. And of course, Jeff DeBelko, as our longtime director of ECSP, who from the early years of environmental security has been a leading thinker on these connections. We're grateful he's here today and that he continues to inform our work as a senior advisor to ECSP from his current seat at Ohio University. You'll also hear from Mike Sfraga today, who directs our Global Risk and Resilience program, under which ECSP sits. Mike has spent the better part of 2 years establishing the Wilson Center's Polar Institute as the go-to resource on Arctic issues in DC. A geographer by training and former vice chancellor of the University of Alaska at Fairbanks, that's right, University of Alaska at Fairbanks, Mike personifies the Wilson Center's mission to bring scholarship and practice together to inform foreign policy. So whether we're focusing on risk and resilience in the Arctic, or in the Lake Chad Basin, or across the Caribbean, the risks facing local communities are global risks. And of those risks, water is one that unites us like no other. Because of that, it provides an avenue for cooperation and building resilience. And of course, water is a topic that runs deep and wide and cannot be covered in a single day. In the last year alone, we've had the honor of working with USAID, CNA's Military Advisory Board, with the U.S. Water Partnership, WWF, the Sustainable Water Partnership, EcoPeace Middle East, the Environmental Law Institute, and Global Water 2020 to host a number of public events focused on water security. From providing access to safe water and sanitation in the most vulnerable parts of the world, to understanding how global water security connects to U.S. national security interests. So let's go ahead and get today's conversation started. To do that, allow me to introduce our fearless leader, Jane Harmon, who leads the Wilson Center as its president and CEO. Many of you know Congresswoman Harmon from the 9 terms she served as a representative from California. She's an internationally recognized authority on U.S. and global security issues and foreign relations. As Congresswoman, she served in all of the major security committees. She's a member of the Defense Policy Board and the Homeland Security Advisory Committee. And of course, as a native Californian, she is intimately familiar with the importance of water to human well-being and security.
So it's the all-female intro team, and proud of that. Also excited that there will be more than 100 women in the United States Congress. I call that a good start. Now it just has to work. Don't we agree? I think these people didn't come there to be part of a blue wave. They fought so hard to get something done, and that's just my prayer for the next Congress. At any rate, as Lauren said, I fled Congress in the middle of my 9th term to come to a place that is bipartisan and that conducts civil conversation based on deep research and tries to come up with the best policy options. None of that applies to the place I used to work, and sadly, none of it applies now to the place I used to work. I do come from California. I have a beach house in Venice Beach, which is a tsunami zone. Focus yourselves on that. And I learned from day one in Congress that water was California's big issue. Think Chinatown, the movie, but seriously, water is California's big issue. And we all know that 2/3 of the planet's surface is water, and over time we have lost about 1/4 of its original mass, since it's the primary nutrient necessary to keep humans and animals alive. That is really scary. There's too little water in some places and too much in others, increasing pollution, especially from fossil fuels. And we have a Choke Point China program that really focuses on this, is reducing the availability and quality of water. Hurricanes and the flooding they cause have devastated parts of the U.S. in recent months. Plus, climate change, yes, there is climate change, has brought severe drought and gigantic fires to places like my home state of California. For those of you who just came from California, you will know that the air quality at both ends, Northern California, all along the coast and in Marin, and obviously north of that, and in the LA area, was absolutely horrible. Health risk, air quality, and obviously the devastation caused to so many is unprecedented in California's history. Anyway, quite simply, we are in a water crisis, and solving this problem is going to take a multidisciplinary global approach, something the Wilson Center excels in. Surprise! That is why today, as part of our 50th anniversary celebration, as Lauren said, we are hosting Water at Wilson, 50 years of water conflict and cooperation. And the good news is that the Trump administration has some real chops on the water issue, especially our neighbor in the Reagan building, USAID. Which has been an important partner of the center to assess how environment, health, and security are connected, and how specific cross-sectoral interventions can create resilience. And by the way, Lauren, I thought we were renaming ECSP to be ERRP? Yeah, Environmental Risk and Resilience, or Global Risk and anyway, GRRP. Jeff, I don't know what, we salute your leadership of ECSP, but now we're doing, what is it? GRR? GRRP, GURP. Yes, we're doing GURP. So we're very grateful to USAID, which has not changed its name, so far as I know, and to our other strong partner, the World Wildlife Fund, as Lauren mentioned, which has elevated the importance of water security in U.S. foreign policy. Last year, I co-wrote an article for New Security Beat with WWF CEO Carter Roberts about the importance of tackling global water challenges. It is still important. And we're delighted to be hosting here today two of the leaders of U.S. global water strategy, Jim Peters and Erin Salzburg, among others who are our dearest friends here, and applaud their efforts over the last year toward a more water-secure world. Jim, USAID's acting global water coordinator, is our first keynote speaker. He previously served as Deputy Mission Director for USAID Pakistan, very important position, and as the Assistant General Counsel for Ethics and Administration at USAID. He brings the unique and valuable perspective of having served in both USAID and the Department of Defense as an attorney in the Air Force before joining USAID. So please welcome Jim Peters.
Well, Congresswoman Harman, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm as USAID's acting global water coordinator. I'd like to welcome you all here today to this very important event, and I'd like to congratulate the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars on 50 years of bipartisan insights and promoting dialogue on America's indispensable contributions to the global community. So given that we're celebrating this 50 years, I thought we'd start with where we were in this sector 50 years ago. In preparing for these remarks and in talking with my team, it was very hard to find any data for where we were at that time globally. It just doesn't exist. The fact that we even have those now is a major innovation. But 50 years ago, here at home, President Johnson wrote in a letter to Congress, "A plentiful and reliable water supply is the elixir of our national life and future growth. Responsible government cannot overlook the importance of water management to the nation's economy and health." Now, at the same time LBJ was making this call here at home, other countries were doing the same. In the 1960s, South Korea only had about 20% of its people who had access to piped water. There were no sewage systems, and water sources were highly contaminated with parasites. Then South Korea launched an initiative focused on providing sanitation as part of a multi-sector drive for economic development across the country. Water and sanitation governance and policy and financing reforms soon followed. At the outset of these initiatives, per capita income in South Korea was about equivalent to many sub-Saharan African countries. Now, South Korea has the 12th largest economy in the world and universal access to piped water and sanitation. Since its graduation from U.S. development assistance in 1980, South Korea has gone from aid recipient to a global aid donor and America's 8th largest trading partner. All this progress occurred within 2 generations. This example of South Korea shows just how important water and sanitation can be to helping a country become self-reliant and solve their own development challenges. The world has made major progress since 50 years ago, as I mentioned, when we didn't even have a global mechanism to track water access data. But we still have a long way to go in reaching a world where all governments recognize and invest in the importance of water security for health and economic growth, and the importance of sanitation to a safe drinking water supply. So it's been 1 year since the launch of this president's global water strategy, the first ever U.S. government-wide water strategy, which lays out a vision for a water-secure world where people and nations have the water they need to be healthy, prosperous, and resilient. In this new era under the strategy, the U.S. is focused on 4 core strategic objectives. Those are, first, promoting sustainable access to drinking water and sanitation services and the adoption of key hygiene behaviors. Second, encouraging sound water resources management. Third, reducing conflict by promoting cooperation on shared waters. And fourth, strengthening sector governance, financing, and institutions. Now, a single year, as you all know, is just too short to claim any quantitative results. So instead, I'd like to share how USAID is approaching one of the most important issues of our time, and that is supporting governments to make safe water and sanitation available and sustainable to the underserved while laying a foundation for economic growth, resilience, and stability at the national, regional, and global levels. USAID's specific contributions to that whole of government strategy build upon over a decade of successes, challenges, and lessons learned from our water and sanitation assistance. From that experience, we know that official development assistance is not enough to help partner countries move away from aid and towards self-reliance. As our USAID administrator, Mark Green, says, we provide development assistance to help partner countries on their own development journey to self-reliance. Over the long run, our goal is to have countries go from being recipients to partners to donors. That's exactly what happened in the Republic of Korea. In the water and sanitation sector, the goals of the Water for the World Act, which were advanced by the Global Water Strategy and USAID's Water and Development Plan, represent a confluence with USAID's vision of self-reliance worldwide. Many of you here are familiar with the estimate that upwards of $114 billion per year of capital expenditures are required to achieve universal access to safe water and sanitation services by 2030. That amount is 3 times the current level of global investment from official sources. To help close this gap, we have to, it's imperative, that we mobilize new sources of financing. We need sustainable water and sanitation services that reach the most vulnerable. We also need to increase our diplomatic engagement to promote cooperation. We have to harness innovation and scientific expertise, and we need to protect vital water resources. At the core of our contributions to the strategy is strengthening governance and institutions and mobilizing innovative financing to help partner countries provide their citizens with affordable, equitable, and sustainable access to safe water and sanitation. Strengthening governance also means protecting vital natural resources that underpin drinking water services. We believe that water is an ideal entry point to advance core democratic principles around equality, transparency, and accountability. And also, by the way, toward reaching women and girls who bear the burden of water delivery to their communities. Governments that deliver basic water and sanitation services are often seen as working on behalf of people and creating more stability. Success in the water and sanitation sector cannot be defined only by the number of boreholes drilled, toilets or latrines built, or catchment areas under improved management. Instead, we are focusing on building strong and well-funded water systems. That not only means changing our approach, but also how we measure outcomes and adapt our programs. That's why we've invested in new metrics that measure how well a water utility is performing, or how much our partner countries are contributing financially to their own water and sanitation sectors. We're also focusing on building the capacity of partner countries to better monitor water services and supply. Our support to many partner countries provides a roadmap for the new direction we are already taking with the strategy. Let me just give you a couple of examples. In Nigeria, USAID recently launched a new partnership with 6 states to reform and professionalize the water sector and to reach more than 3 million people with safe and reliable drinking water. The states were competitively selected based on commitment to reform, existing infrastructure, and potential for positive impact. USAID is also working with the Kenyan government and the private sector there to reform water and sanitation. The government of Kenya has increased public sector funding to address water and sanitation challenges, but still more than 60% of the sector funding is coming from external donors. To fill that funding gap, USAID has helped catalyze new sources of financing for Kenya's water and sanitation service providers. To date, USAID Kenya has helped mobilize over $62 million of commercial financing into the sector, resulting in more households, schools, and health facilities receiving safe drinking water. As a final example, through USAID's support to the Philippines, water utilities representing 1.2 million customers in disaster-prone areas are implementing business and emergency response measures to become more resilient. These measures ensure continued water service in the event of typhoons, floods, and drought. I'm confident we can work with our other partner countries on a path toward a secure water future defined by resilience, equality, and peace. While water problems have always been complex, over this last 50 years, they've become even more complex. An ever-increasing demand for water, environmental shocks and stressors, and ongoing lack of access to basic services continue to provide pressures on resources. And as a result, the risk of water-related violence and conflict is growing. The U.S. National Intelligence Community classified these water-related risks as threat to U.S. national security. And the intelligence community stated that water shortages and lack of access to water and sanitation can trigger instability, regional tensions, and even state failure. In addition to this assessment, new research from the World Bank underscores that state fragility, especially related to violent conflict and how it significantly reduces and weakens government's ability to provide that basic water and sanitation service. So finally, let me just end with talking a little bit more about the global water strategy and the shared vision of both the Congress and this administration, and the journey to self-reliance that all tap the resources of the U.S. government. Those resources are not only monetary, but also the innovation we bring and our unique ability to be able to catalyze catalyze innovation and technical support, leading to wholesale change. And to that end, I'd like to just say that I'm always happy to share the podium with Erin Salzburg, my colleague from the Department of State, and the vigor that we bring that under Erin's leadership to the interagency collaboration. I'm also delighted to be with this group and the folks that are watching on the live stream. The water sector stakeholders are the most vibrant there is, and the amount of collaboration we get is truly an inspiration to me. It really keeps me going. My USAID colleagues can tell you that in every document I edit, I remove any reference to congratulating ourselves or to celebrating achievements. This community represented in this room does have some great success stories, but it's not time to sit back. We have work to do. And just as we think about that time 50 years ago as akin to the dark ages in this sector, I'd like to think about that time in the future, hopefully not 50 years, when anything short of universal access and sound management is considered unthinkable. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim, for your insights and for your leadership on these issues at USAID. Next, we're going to hear from Erin Salzburg. I think many of you in the room know Erin. He's the water guy at State, where he manages the development and implementation of U.S. foreign policy on drinking water and sanitation, water resources management, and transboundary water within the Bureau of Oceans, Environment, and Science Affairs. In this position, he led development of the first U.S. Global Water Strategy, and now we get to hear a little bit from him on how it's going 1 year in. Following Erin, we'll hear from John Matthews, who is the co-founder and lead of the Alliance for, is it Alliance or Association, John? Alliance. Thank you. I have it wrong here. Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, which is hosted by the World Bank and CIWI. John's work integrates climate change adaptation policy and science into sustainable natural resource management, infrastructure operations, and economic development. And by its very definition, it works across sectors and communities of practice to secure water around the world. Erin.
Good morning. Thank you. Thanks, Lauren. It's always tough to follow Jim. And they always leave out that I was published in Glamour magazine, so I always brag about that, especially when I'm in scientific fora. A lot of scientists brag about they were published in Science magazine and PNAS. Glamour magazine has greater readership than all those combined. So I just want to lay claim that I'm probably the best published author in the room. But thank you, Lauren. And again, seriously, congratulations to the Woodrow Wilson Center on 50 years. What a better way to celebrate and to talk about water and to appreciate the important role that the Wilson Center has played in elevating the connections between water, peace, and security. And so congratulations to the Wilson Center. I also want to take a minute, Jim referenced this, but just to point out my colleagues from the Interagency Water Working Group. I think there are a few of them in the room, of course, USAID, and there's a number of them spread throughout. But I think I see NOAA, NASA, maybe EPA, USGS, USDA, a couple of others. I apologize if I missed you, but for those of you who aren't aware, this interagency group is really the brains behind what the U.S. government is doing on international water issues. They're the smarts. They're the people who tell us how we can approach, what the challenges are, how we can solve some of these types of challenges. I've been incredibly fortunate to chair that group for a number of years. I'm just the face, but it's really their knowledge, their expertise, their personal commitment and passion and engagement for these issues that's really pushed the United States government forward on this. And so if you get the chance to engage them throughout the day, please do. They're really the unsung heroes here. So Jim really did a good job on this, but maybe just to put a fine point on what we see are some of the challenges around water issues and how do we as the U.S. government think about the Internet Global Water Challenge. And maybe the first is that, and Jim alluded to this, there are still a number of countries where we have a significant portion of the population that lack access to sustainable supplies of safe drinking water and to basic sanitation. And this is true across sub-Saharan Africa, many places in Asia, and of course the East Asia Pacific region. And not only is this a threat to human health, But this lack of access to basic services can impede economic development. It can play a role in migration. It can play a role in civil unrest, and it can aid in terrorist recruitment. And so all these are challenges that can impact our national security interests, and it's a reason why we think these things are important. The second issue that we look at globally is that we have a number of countries across North Africa, the Middle East, Central and South Asia, that are at risk of failure if they can't get the water equation right. In other words, these countries are fundamentally water insecure, and either now or sometime in the near future will lack the water that they need to meet human needs, economic, environmental needs, and if these countries can't manage those kinds of problems, they're at increased risk of failure, greater fragility. A report released by the World Bank just a couple of years ago identified a number of countries that if they continue as under a business as usual scenario, are at risk of losing as much as 6% or more of their GDP by 2030 because of water. 6% GDP, that's enough to keep countries in poverty, that's enough to push new countries into poverty. Real challenges. This lack of sustainable supplies of water, of sufficient quality and quantity, or increasing floods and risks, it'll undermine food security, energy security. It'll make these countries, again, more fragile, more likely to fail, and it will erode their capacity to address concerns that are important to the United States. So water insecurity is the second challenge. The third challenge, and again, Jim alluded a little bit to this, and that is we're seeing increasing tensions over scarce water resources. And we know that conflicts over water between countries are rare. We do, however, see water playing an increasing role in conflicts at the local level, in exacerbating regional tensions, and as a tool in existing conflicts. And we've seen this, of course, recent disputes on the Nile, the Indus, water issues in Syria, Yemen, Iraq. These are all good examples of situations like this. There's perhaps a fourth challenge, and this is one that we don't talk about as often, but it's really the lack of political commitment by governments in prioritizing water and sanitation issues in their own national development plans and strategies. In other words, make water a policy and budget priority, to put local, national, and regional mechanisms in place to ensure that water can be managed in an integrated and holistic way in a cooperative manner for the benefit of all. This is a real challenge for us, even in the development side. Remember, we're responding to the interests that the governments themselves prioritize. If the governments aren't prioritizing dealing with these issues, it's very difficult for the international donor community to respond. It's very difficult to work on the enabling environment to ensure that all the right policy and regulatory tools are in place. So this idea of prioritization, the idea of getting countries to prioritize this issue, is critically important. And that's probably the fourth challenge that I think we face internationally. These are the challenges that we were thinking about when we developed the Global Water Strategy. For those of you who haven't seen it, this is a picture courtesy of USAID, printed these. It's a great read. You haven't done it, and as Jim mentioned, there are 4 strategic objectives in this strategy. Again, just to go through them quickly, but add perhaps a little bit more on all of them. The first objective is to increase access to safe drinking water and sanitation and hygiene, with a real focus on the underserved population. Jim talked a great deal about that, so I won't belabor that anymore. The second is really about this idea of encouraging sound management and protection of freshwater resources. And this is really about improving water security, resiliency, and sustainability. It's about increasing the productivity of water resources. It's about optimizing the benefits of water across competing uses. So it's really this energy, water, food, environment nexus, all coming together, and it's trying to address that second challenge that we see about countries being insecure, being water insecure. And then the third area is this idea of promoting cooperation on shared waters, and you hear a lot about that today. But just to point out, we really are doing this for 2 reasons. One is reduce the likelihood for conflict, but the other is that, water is a fantastic tool to build trust and cooperation and to strengthen regional integration. Jim mentioned the benefits of water in improving transparency and accountability of institutions working on these and building a sense that the government is being responsive to the needs of the public. Very important aspects of working on water local issues. The same is true in working on water regionally and what it can do to help bind and tie a region together, create ties that will stabilize regions across the world. So that's a very important part of this idea of promoting cooperation. The fourth objective, Jim mentioned this a little bit as well, the one that underpins the other three, which is really to strengthen water sector governance, financing, and institutions. This is about transitioning countries to a greater reliance, less reliance on donor assistance. It's about ensuring the enabling environment is in place to support the sustainable management of water resources and ensure universal access to safe drinking water and sanitation for everyone. This is perhaps one of the most important objectives of this strategy. We're also looking to strengthen U.S. exports. Many of you know this, the international market for water and wastewater technologies is on the order of $700 billion a year and growing. This is an opportunity for U.S. businesses. And so we would certainly like to expand opportunities for U.S. businesses. We also identify a number of priority countries in the strategy pursuant to the Water for the World Act, and Jim has discussed some of our efforts in that. But I also want to emphasize those are not the only countries where the United States is working and are not the only countries that are a priority for the United States. Those are the countries pursuant to the legislation that was written. However, there are many other countries and regions that the United States is working in, and that's an important message not to lose. It's much more than just those 10 or 13 countries that we talk about. I also want to note for those folks who haven't gone through the strategy itself is actually pretty small. It's only maybe 5 or 6 pages. What makes up the bulk of this is there were 16 government U.S. agencies and departments that submitted their own implementation plans. And so I really encourage you to take a look at that. That really was a major step forward for us as a government. It was a whole of government approach. All the agencies were sitting down and thinking collectively about what they could do, what steps they could take to help operationalize this strategy. And it really does represent, I think, a major step forward. I think Jim talked about the real progress that I think we're making on expanding access to safe drinking water and sanitation, particularly in the priority countries. We're also looking closely at how we can bring greater attention to increasing access to safe drinking water and sanitation in places like healthcare facilities and cholera hotspots, and how we make those overlaps work in a better way. On water security, the United States has been working to implement the EGAD water policy to strengthen water resources management in the Horn of Africa. EGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority for Development in the Horn of Africa. It's a collective body of all those different countries. They have a water policy in place. How do you translate that into an actual protocol that the countries can implement and operationalize to help promote cooperation on transboundary water between some very tough countries, right? Is Ethiopia, Somalia, Eritrea, South Sudan, Uganda, very interesting area to work in. Kenya, so an important area for us. We've launched support with many of our partners and agencies in this room, and actually a number of development partners globally. The Mekong Water Data Initiative to improve the collection, analysis, and sharing of water-related data throughout the lower Mekong. Secretary Pompeo launched this and has convened a number of meetings around how we can promote data sharing to improve the sustainability of natural resource management within the Mekong region. So that was an important step forward. We're also starting a new set of activities with our partners from WWF between Namibia, Angola, and Botswana to improve the management of shared waters. And of course, we've also made some progress in elevating global attention to water and sanitation issues. Recently, in fact, just last week, our teams in Washington and New York, we just completed a series of negotiations on a new UN General Assembly resolution that will add 2 new major events to the International Water Calendar. A one-day meeting in 2021 to promote implementation of the international water-related goals and targets, and a 3-day meeting in March of 2023 to measure progress in implementing the water decade and advancing water activities related to the SDGs. So, again, the United States is working hard to ensure that there are opportunities for us to reach out to countries, build support for why they need to prioritize these issues among the countries, and get them again to prioritize water and sanitation issues more highly in their own national development plans and strategies. So we're making progress. Perhaps not as fast as any of us would like, but we're getting there. I think we're hopeful over the next year that we can find ways of working with all of you in the room, all of those of you on the webcast, so that we might better leverage our efforts to implement the global water strategy. And I think I'm optimistic that working with all of you, this is not something the U.S. government can do alone. You are our partners in this endeavor. And I think by working together, the U.S. commitment certainly remains strong to international water issues. I think by working together, we can create a more water secure future. So thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is John Matthews. I'm with a group called the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, AGWA. We're a global network with about 1,400 water and climate professionals around the world. We're co-chaired by the World Bank and by SIWI, the Stockholm International Water Institute. I'm really honored, very pleased to be here today. And what I'm going to be talking about is climate change. And the interaction between climate change and how we think about sustainability itself, especially water sustainability. Oh, fantastic, thanks. And one of the things, it's really easy to scare people with climate change issues. But I actually would like to talk about climate change as an opportunity and a revisioning of how we think about sustainability itself. In many ways, I think of AGWA as an organization that we're trying to shift our framework for how we envision sustainability for water resources from thinking about a few years or a few decades to managing water sustainably over centuries. I want to start off with a scary picture. This is the Kariba Dam. This is on the Zambezi, an African example. And arguably, this is one of the worst dams in the world. There are a lot of reasons why it's a bad dam. But climate change is one of the more recent and most pressing issues. This dam is only a little bit older than me. I'm 50. And it already has massive gaps in terms of the climate that it was designed for and the climate that it exists in now. And part of the reason that we got into this mess with the Kariba Dam is that our definition of sustainability for water resources management for this basin is fundamentally flawed. It's often based on a finance period, maybe on a political agenda. It could be based on some engagement with the private sector. This is one of the oldest dams in the world. It's the Duzhongyang Irrigation Facility in Sichuan Province in western China. It is over 2,000 years old. It serves 20 million people. It has done so sustainably for a remarkably long time. At the time that it was built, it had an integrated fish ladder. This is a very humble piece of engineering, and they started with a very different set of assumptions. How long can we make it last? How long can it last? What happens afterwards? It's a very humble approach, I think, to managing water. This is a great quote. It's a little bit hard to see. It's from Stefan Holoh, a white paper that he wrote with some colleagues at the World Bank. He's probably the most famous climate change economist. He wrote, "Many investment decisions have long-term consequences. Infrastructure in particular can shape development for decades or centuries, a duration that often extends beyond that infrastructure's lifetime because the economic system reorganizes itself around them." And I would argue that ecosystems and governance systems also reorganize themselves around infrastructure. And this is an example of contemporary investment. This is just a few years old. It's in eastern Nepal in the Koshi Basin. This actually was a product of U.S. investment being implemented by Chinese engineers. It's a small dam, small hydropower dam meant to supply energy for the surrounding communities as well as for Kathmandu. The day that I went, it was maybe 3 or 4 years old at that point. It was already underperforming at a level of about 80%. It had a profound mismatch from the day that it was built with its climate. And that mismatch will only increase. The Kariba Dam is just a taste of what is going to happen in places where climate change is going very quickly. No one's going to tear down this dam. Below it already there were 4 or 5 kilometers of dead river. Absolutely no water in the river. And very little electricity coming from it. This is a more domestic example. If we think about the Colorado River Basin, I think of it as kind of the poster child for climate impacts in much of the world. When we wrote the Colorado Compact, the governance agreement for the U.S. side of the basin, we only had a small snippet of actual recorded data for the basin, just about 32 years. And that governance framework has become itself a type of infrastructure. It's very rigid. It's been very difficult to make adjustments to. Since then, we have developed a much longer record of history. This is about 1,200 years of history. I could extend it back another 500 years or so now. This is from Treering Data showing the kind of deep perspective of what's been happening in the Colorado over that period of time. And you see on the little bit of the right, we are plunging down below the 1,200-year average already. And we're probably going to go a lot farther than that. Why does this matter? Well, the regional climate is drying up. The infrastructure parameters don't fit anymore. And we made what I would say are some very unhumble assumptions about what the Colorado River is like. But this is a story of Ethiopia. This is a story of Turkey or India or Pakistan or Cambodia. This is, most of those countries, we only have 30 or 40 years worth of data. We don't go back very far, and we have assumed that the past is an effective prediction for the future. But I think probably no one in this room believes that anymore. We have so many deep uncertainties that we're facing, and we need a different type of approach. My question is, if we were to go back to the people who were designing the Hoover Dam, a dam that arguably transformed part of the U.S. from a few 100,000 people to 40 million people today, what would we say to them? What would we say that they should do differently? That's actually where I have what I think of as a positive message. The way that we have traditionally, really for centuries, potentially millennia, approached water resources management is a very top-down orientation. We start with a decision maker that's handed off to a technical analyst, often an engineer. The decision maker is the one who defines the problem or the need. Technical analyst develops a single, usually highly optimized solution. Then this is presented to the users and stakeholders. The decision maker, the technical analyst, has crossed his or her fingers and kind of hopes that this is a good enough solution. But we know that this is inappropriate. We have lots of non-stationary drivers, not just climate change. And if anything, we become more and more aware of these other non-stationary drivers in just the past couple of years globally. In the past 20 years, we started to tack on a little climate vulnerability assessment, very little standardization in that process. But this is what we have been doing for a long time. Starting around 2009, 2010, a major change started to happen. These are typically referred to now as bottom-up approaches. We start with a technical analyst working directly with the users and the stakeholders. They develop a shared vision. I note that was actually a phrase both of the previous speakers really emphasized. They together envision what the problem, what the need is that connects to water. They develop multiple solutions. These are then confronted with a range of climate variables to test their suitability, their effectiveness, and the decision maker picks one, often today, more than one for a more flexible series of options, often based on other criteria such as cost or political suitability. This is a fundamental revolution, actually, in how we think about water resources. Now, most of the examples that we've seen to date of bottom-up approaches have been what I think of as boutique applications. They're very one-off. They're really hard to replicate. They're not easy for someone to be able to mainstream. There's often a kind of a institutional experimentation process that goes on. However, in the past couple of years, we have seen more systematic approaches. The World Bank, in the global water practice around 2015, started to ramp up with a very large program now called the Decision Tree Framework. It was led by Diego Rodriguez at the bank, co-founder of Agua, an economist, And then the technical work was led by Patrick Ray, University of Cincinnati, and Casey Brown at University of Massachusetts Amherst. This is a huge revolution at the World Bank in how they begin to apply a risk assessment and completely mainstream this through their $25 billion or so a year annual investments in water. Just about a month ago, UNESCO published a second standardization guide, Climate Risk-Informed Decision Analysis. This was really a partnership between the Dutch government, Deltatis, UNESCO, the Institute for Water Resources, and AGWA as well, and ICWARM in the US too. And this is a design much more for the developing world, for a developing world water managers to be able to mainstream bottom-up approaches in their programs. How does this work in practice? Again, the technical analyst is working with stakeholders to develop this shared vision. Then that analyst needs to translate, almost act as a kind of midwife for the stakeholders, turn their qualities, their vision into a set of performance indicators that go into a stress test. And then two types of solutions are developed. One is a robust set of solutions, that is, thinking across a wide range of potential futures. What is it that we can credibly estimate and envision might happen in the future? But there's so much uncertainty that remains, especially over the lifetime of most pieces of infrastructure. The Kariba Dam will probably be there for another 200 years. The Hoover Dam will probably be there for another 300 years. So how is it that we manage these pieces of infrastructure over those timescales? That's where flexibility becomes really important. We also think a lot about nature-based solutions as a mechanism to integrate into this process at a very fundamental level, because we recognize that nature-based solutions are really a part of our infrastructure landscape. Water is, in effect, a kind of invisible utility, and it's both above in terms of the climate, and it's the ground and below in terms of the eco-hydrological landscape. This is an example of decision scaling of a robust approach. This is from Colorado Springs, actually, and trying to communicate in a very powerful and direct way what are the management and design and planning targets to individual decision makers. And this is an example of some of the Dutch expertise thinking about adaptation pathways, about governance and flexibility, and really long-term thinking across multiple options. Finance is also a really critical element here, and some of these ideas have started to trickle into the finance world. And green and climate bonds are an explosive area. In 2007, when they were created as a category, they were only about 1 or 2 billion US. This year, they should pass 200 billion. It's an amazing amount of growth. It's probably 50 billion in China alone this year in this category. And a partnership of the organizations that you see below put together a set of resilience criteria that try to embody these bottom-up approaches and score them in a set of criteria that can then be advertised to investors in the private sector. And these are being applied not just in San Francisco, where the first issuance came from, but also in West and Southern Africa and in East Asia. Last week, over the Thanksgiving holiday, I had the deep pleasure of scoring a climate adaptation project in Lagos. So, and I'd like to just end with a final thought. It was a small meeting at the World Bank about 2 years ago, and I heard a senior manager there stand up and say, "We build things that last 300 years. Why don't we think about sustainability for that long?" And I believe that that's a really important and increasingly widespread insight about how it is that we need to shift our whole framework in how we implement water resources management. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you, John. I think, thank you, Jim, too. I think those 3 presentations all set a really strong foundation for the rest of the day's discussion, and I appreciate all of your leadership on these issues. I'd now like to welcome the first panel to the stage. please don't be shy. Come join us. This first conversation is going to be facilitated by Cynthia Brady, a senior peacebuilding and conflict advisor with USAID in the Bureau for Food Security and the Center for Resilience. In her role at USAID, Cynthia identifies sources of the conflict, fragility, and violence, supports early responses to address the causes and consequences of fragility and conflict, and integrates conflict sensitivity across the USAID strategy and programs. She's a longtime partner and collaborator to our work in ECSP, and this panel could not be in better hands. She'll introduce the panelists, and while they're getting settled in, I'll make a quick logistical note. The event is being webcast live, so when it comes to the Q&A portion, please wait to be handed a mic. Cynthia will indicate who should be handed a mic, and then you'll need to wait, and then give your name and affiliation before getting quickly to your question. If you have a comment, that's fine. Make it quick and make it a question, okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first panel. Thank you to the first few speakers for setting up our panel really nicely. John, in particular, I think gave us an almost perfect lead-in. The purpose of this panel is to look at what we know about water-related conflict and cooperation today, but more importantly, to think about what we need to consider in terms of how that might look different in the future. And we will discuss some of the critical emerging and growing challenges to water security. And I hope that we'll also identify some of the specific gaps that these incredible panelists see in research, in field practice, and in the policy space so that we can have a discussion about that and what we need to focus on moving forward. I hope that you're genuinely all as excited as I am to be here today. This is truly an incredible group of panelists. I happen to know them and their work very well, and they have a lot of great insights to bring. So I know that we're going to have a great conversation after their presentations as well. And you have all of their full biographies, so you can see exactly all of their credentials and how impressive they all are. But I will give you just a few points so that you can contextualize who you are listening to. Our first speaker will be Scott Moore, who is a political scientist whose work focuses on water politics and policy, particularly in China and South Asia. He is currently a senior fellow at the Penn Water Center and the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy, as well as director of China programs in the Office of the Provost at the University of Pennsylvania. And if you're looking for a good read, Scott has a brand new book that you might want to pick up, Subnational Hydropolitics, Conflict, Cooperation, and Institution Building in Shared River Basins. Imran Ali is focused on the nexus of public health challenges and humanitarian crises. He has worked in some of the world's worst displacement crises, including South Sudan, Pakistan, Jordan, Rwanda, and Uganda. And he led the development of the first evidence-based guidance for safe water supply in refugee and IDP camps. He is currently an inaugural Global Health and Humanitarianism Fellow at York University. Next is Richard Matthew. Richard is professor of international and environmental politics in the schools of social ecology and social science at the University of California at Irvine, and he is the founding director of the Center for Unconventional Security Affairs. His work has focused on issues such as the environmental dimensions of conflict and peacebuilding, climate change adaptation in conflict and post-conflict societies, and transnational threat systems. So luckily, he tackles all the easy issues. And finally, we have Janani Vivekananda, who is a senior advisor on climate change and peacebuilding at Adelphi in Berlin. She is also currently leading work around climate and fragility risk in the Lake Chad region. And Janani has done extensive field and policy work on resilience, conflict, and climate change, and she served as one of the lead authors of the 2015 flagship report, A New Climate for Peace, which focuses on understanding compound risks and addressing climate change impacts in fragile states. So we have a great diversity of perspectives on this panel, and I look forward to the conversation. So let's kick it off with Scott.
Thanks so much. First of all, I just want to thank the Wilson Center for bringing us all together today for this discussion. And I also just want to say I'm particularly honored to be here because my little corner of the academic world is to look at environmental politics and policy, particularly in China. And Jennifer Turner, longstanding member of the staff here at the Wilson Center, was my inspiration in following that path and is the inspiration, I think, for virtually everybody else who has operated in that in that space. So thanks to the Wilson Center and the China Environment Forum for all the great work that they've done, particularly in China and on China. So I wanted to be a little bit provocative, perhaps, since I'm kind of kicking things off this morning in our panel, at least, and focus on three myths or half myths that I think are commonly held with respect to water and conflict, and that I encountered a lot in doing the research for my book. And I think that in doing that, I do want to be perhaps a little bit provocative, but I want to do that partly because I think the question and the issue of water and conflict, it's certainly more complex than it's sometimes made out to be, but I think it's also a little bit more hopeful of a story than it's sometimes made out to be. And I hope that I can convince you of that at least a little bit. So I think the first and most fundamental kind of misconception I want to address is that there is something that's conducive to conflict, something about water that's inherent to it that is conducive to conflict, or that the kind of basic fact of sharing water will, in all likelihood or somehow probabilistically, lead the people who share it to some form of conflict. And particularly when we look at one of the most acute kind of manifestations of water and conflict, the risk of warfare or violence between countries, the facts just simply don't bear that out. So this graph here displays some work that was done about 10 years ago, and that actually one of our speakers this afternoon, Professor Erin Wolf, was involved in. It's still one of the most comprehensive attempts, I think, to quantify potential incidences of conflict over water at the international level. So they ended up coding about 6,500 water-related incidents that occurred, had some international dimension from 1948 to 2008. Less than 30 of those involved any type of violence, and exactly 0 involved warfare between countries or states. At the same time, though, you had something like 350 international water agreements that were concluded over roughly the same time period. And I think that gives you some rough indication of how the kind of argument that you sometimes hear that the wars of the next century or this century will be fought over water aren't entirely well-founded in the historical record, at least in recent times. And I would submit to you that also when you sort of drill down and think of many of the transboundary river basins that are commonly cited as sources of tension, places like the Brahmaputra, which I've spent a bit of time looking on, you can certainly find sources of tension or examples of tension between the countries that share those river systems, but you can also find good examples of cooperation. So with the Brahmaputra for the last 5 years or so, there's been a pretty decent and robust hydrological data sharing mechanism and protocol that's been set up between the Chinese and Indian governments. It's actually worked pretty well. Just a few weeks ago, there was a fairly dramatic incident where there was a large rock slide that ended up creating a natural dam in the Chinese portion of the upper Brahmaputra, and that created a fairly significant flood hazard risk to the downstream reaches. The Chinese government utilized this information sharing protocol to inform the Indian government, and there was quite a bit of communication around that. So I think you can virtually, and I think those types of examples could be replicated in virtually every large transboundary river basin. So it's not a kind of one-dimensional story of just because there are some tensions between countries over water that necessarily implies either that there will be conflict or, on the other hand, that there's an absence of cooperation. Both can be true, and both are often true. That's not to say, though, that there is no such thing as water in conflict, and that kind of gets to the second major myth or potential misconception, and that's the one that I've focused on a lot in this recent book, which is trying to understand how conflict over water unfolds at the subnational level. And it is certainly true that there is quite a bit of that. Even though, just to kind of highlight the point, frequently we tend to focus, when you think about water and conflict at sort of a high level, we do tend to focus on the international stage and on the prospect of some type of warfare or interstate violence. That's understandable because it's dramatic, the implications are great. But again, if you kind of look at the empirical record, we have a lot more examples of cooperation at the subnational level. And there are good both conceptual and empirical kind of dimensions of that or reasons for that. At a conceptual level, if you think about the kind of logic for why we would want to be concerned about the threat of interstate or international conflict over water, it really has to do with the fact that virtually all major river basins are shared between multiple countries, and yet that problem is magnified several-fold if you think about major water resources or waterways being shared between subnational jurisdictions, states, provinces, counties, prefectures, whatever. And that's what this kind of map here shows, just overlays the world's major river basins on the world's major subnational administrative boundaries. Just shows you that there are virtually no major river basins that are contained within single subnational jurisdictions. But on the other hand, if we sort of walk around major countries in the world, we can usually come up with some really good examples of long lasting subnational conflicts over water. And particularly that's true if we sort of think about conflict over water, not necessarily in the form of violence, but also political, legal, or rhetorical forms of conflict. Here in the U.S., the best known example probably is the Colorado River Basin, but you can find examples of that, similar examples in pretty much every major country. The Murray-Darling in Australia, virtually every river basin in India features some type of long-lasting interstate water dispute. Even in China, where I've spent a lot of time, there are good examples of interprovincial and other types of interjurisdictional conflicts over water. So I think it just sort of serves to highlight the point that the subnational level is often where we find kind of the most acute and certainly the most widespread manifestations of water and conflict. And I might just very quickly say that in looking at some of these cases around the world, I came up with sort of two main conclusions. One is that you tend to see the most long-lasting and the most acrimonious conflict when you when water becomes linked to issues of identity, particularly when that identity has an ethnic, a religious, or a linguistic component. You see that in a lot of the Indian interstate river disputes, where it's become not just an issue of water use in one state versus another, but it's really become an issue of water use by one social group in a way that deprives the other group of water. And it becomes very much embedded in issues of identity conflict, as well as just the sharing of a resource. On the other hand, I did find, and I think this is a little bit more of a hopeful story, where you have a lot of third-party influence, particularly NGOs, that does tend to create the conditions for more cooperation, certainly over time. And that kind of, I had to put up here, by the way, a quote from, this is actually a piece by Professor Wolf a few years ago that, and I think just sort of serves to highlight the overall point again, or underline it, that in looking kind of at historical cases, while we don't have any good examples of water wars between countries, you do tend to see this inverse relationship between looking at the subnational level and getting more examples of conflict over water. Third and finally, third myth, I think we often tend to focus on scarcity as a potential cause of water conflict when we do see conflict over water. And yet I wanted to sort of highlight that certainly in many of the cases that I've looked at, but I think it's borne out by the larger historical record, there's no real direct relationship between physical water scarcity, the existence of physical water scarcity, and the likelihood or intensity of water conflict. To me, a good example of this is the case of the Colorado, where if you look at an 80-year time period from 1934, when governor of Arizona declared martial law and assembled something like a navy to try to block a dam that California wanted to build and to supply water in a way that Arizona feared would deprive it of its future water use, all the way to 2014, when we had Minute 319, which many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, provided some guarantee of stream flow into the lower Colorado, and is a good example, I think, of interstate interjurisdictional cooperation. And yet a lot of the negotiation for that agreement occurred in a period of fairly acute scarcity in the basin. Granted, we're heading into a period, and we could perhaps get into this in some discussion, where scarcity is getting worse and worse in the Colorado, and it's not clear that this record of cooperation will necessarily persist into the future. But I think at a minimum, it should cause us to be a little bit critical of the idea that just because you have increasing scarcity, you're going to be seeing an automatic increase in the intensity of conflict. And in fact, I would argue that we should also be equally, if not more, focused on things like pollution as a potential source of conflict over water, as well as infrastructure construction. We heard a little bit about that in previous presentations, and I think if you look at trends like China's Belt and Road Development projects, that will see a large increase in the number of hydro dams built around the world. There are potential sources of conflict that we ought to be thinking about that don't necessarily have to do with scarcity, but around other issues related to water. So I will stop there and look forward to some further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. I think that was a great way to open the panel, giving us a broad overview of a lot of these themes. And I think I'm going to keep everyone awake by not following the order of the folks sitting up here. Richard is going to go second and keep us up at a slightly higher level again, talking about modeling displacement and the role of water and security.
Well, thanks very much. Let me
Keeping the speakers awake too.
So let me thank you for inviting me here. I think this is great. I got here late last night from California, where we had just had the good news that the campfire was 100% contained. As you probably know, it's been the big issue for us. I can hardly breathe. This year has been the period of the greatest fire destruction in California's history, with about 1.6 million acres being burned, 20,000 structures, including thousands of homes being absolutely destroyed, hundreds of thousands of people being displaced. We know, and current estimates suggest that the extent of the fires are about twice as what they would be without climate change. So we have an enormous focus, and much of the work that we do that I'm going to talk about today, California is our laboratory, because California has a wide range of water-related challenges. So while we work all over the world, California is where we test a lot of what we're doing. And I really want to do one thing today. I want to suggest that in the past few years, our ability to manage big data, to develop simulations and models, to develop visualization tools that are able to integrate with local knowledge, that can be generated in real time, that can support a wide range of stakeholders, has improved so much that we need to look at this very seriously as an important part of the way we can encourage collaboration and coordination in water issues. A few years ago, much of what we do now would not have been possible, but a combination of better methods and dramatically increased processing time has really changed the sort of the value of big data models, simulations, these sort of spatial analysis tools that we focus on. So if I can figure this out, which I'm a tech person who doesn't, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do. We use big data and local knowledge to generate a wide range of visualization tools. We focus very much on high vulnerability, low resource areas, but also all of California. We co-develop. Everything we do is co-developed with the people who are going to use it, whether this is an extremely poor community in Malawi or whether it's a very wealthy community in Newport Beach. We co-develop it with the people who are going to use the tools, and we discover that way there's a much higher level of understanding, trust, and we're able to customize things and produce outputs that make sense to people, that are appropriate to the sort of decisions they want to make, they need to make, that they're able to make. We've been able to increasingly link these tools to a wide range of things, and our focus really is humanitarian crisis, war, and disaster. And we're also able to integrate the technologies that we've developed with a whole lot of other things. I mean, these days you can integrate technology in ways that was really unthinkable a few years ago, and I think it's really exciting. And I do want to acknowledge all the various sources of funding we've had. So let me start off by, and I should also acknowledge that our core team of developers, so everything I say is really a reflection of a larger team, and this is the modeling team. Why do we focus on what we do? Well, I'm a little bit pessimistic. When you look at the data, the size of disasters. This is from the National Centers for Environmental Information. These are billion-dollar disasters, and you can sort of see the trend. Same thing. This is from NOAA. Same sort of thing. You can see the trend very clearly. So incredible cost. Now billions of dollars of costs per year. Halligetty, who was mentioned earlier, has estimated that by 2050 we could have as much as $1 trillion of infrastructure damage in a single year. Now that's unthinkable. That's an enormous amount of damage. But alongside it is the humanitarian sort of crisis that is linked to extreme events. So we have a big problem. We have an enormous problem. And to model this, there's a number of things that we have to be able to do. And I don't want to suggest that there's a big challenge. First of all, the things that are increasing extreme events there's a lot of uncertainty. So we have to deal in our modeling with a lot of uncertainty, and we use a wide range of techniques. I won't bore you to death with them. But one of the great things is that what we used to, and I'll give you an example. We used to use supercomputers. We used to run a simulation that would take thousands of hours, and we've been able to get that down to, in some cases, minutes. That we can run the same simulation. So we're able to do things that were impossible before, and it's important because the world that we're modeling is changing very dramatically. And all of these things, the pace of coastal development, the rate of deforestation, what's happening with infrastructure in the United States, the American Civil Society of Engineers has rated U.S. infrastructure as a D+. That means it's in its very last leg of life. That's overall infrastructure. That's the drainage systems, that's the tunnels, the bridges, D+. The trouble is, we have very limited understanding of exactly how near collapse or breakdown or failure much of our infrastructure really is. Take the thousands of dams in the country. We know very, very little about them, in fact, except that they're probably close to failure in many cases. The thousands in California certainly are. We have growing poverty and inequality. People are well aware of that. I think it's amazing to think, so much emphasis on population growth, which has been over the last 100 years, increased by a factor of 4.8. The global economy has increased during the same period by a factor of 79 times. 79 times. We're not short on capital, and that's certainly the case in California. California has an economy which it has a population the size of Canada's, but its economy is 60% larger. It still has twice the poverty rate. So we've got some serious challenges of inequality. So models have to take into consideration all of these things. We also have to know that we also have to take into consideration the fact that as we change, not only is it the frequency of events that are changing, but the dynamics of events are changing. So we may get more what we used to think of as, say, 100-year events. They may be happening more frequently. They may be becoming 10 or 20-year events. But how they play out is being affected by land change. So the more surfaces you pave, the more buildings that take place that are put up, it changes. Water moves according to gravity. And so permeability and gravity affect the movement of water. And so as that changes around the world, and it's changing dramatically, it becomes very difficult to know exactly what's going to happen. Where will water move? How quickly will it move? What velocity, how deep will it get? Where will it pool? Where will it stay? How quickly will it drain? Those are the important things to know, and they're difficult. The other thing that we know is that around the world, defense systems are failing. So we have built an elaborate architecture. Think of California. We have thousands of dams. We have aqueducts. We have seawalls. We have drainage systems, and they are slowly being overwhelmed. California hasn't had the big floods that the East Coast has. Our estimates is they're 20 or 30 years off. So we will experience those major events soon if we don't do something about it. So it's difficult. We're dealing with a lot of things, and of course climate change impacts. We're dealing with a lot of things when we put these models together. And what I think is really exciting is that increasingly we're confident about the outputs and our level of agreement with actual events. And it's easy to look back at history and find a high level of agreement when you model. It's when you can model and then the next event sort of is in close agreement with what you predicted. That's when it gets exciting. And so our level of agreement is increasing dramatically. It probably was under 25% a few years ago. It's probably close to 80 or 85% for near-term events now. That's a dramatic increase, which makes the whole thing a lot more useful. To be useful, tools have to provide the right information in the right level of resolution. So there's a FEMA flood map that is used in California to make decisions about flood insurance. And there's our more high resolution map of the same area. And what we know from household surveys is that people find that they can make a lot better decisions when they see the high-resolution map than when they see the more crude maps, which we've been using for decades, not just in this country, but around the world. So this movement, and let me give you an example of what we can, the sort of things that we can do. Dartmouth has an interesting database of flood events culled from newspapers, government accounts, and stuff like this, just every major flood that's taken place in the past 30 years. And so we go through that enormous amount of data, and we can show things like the frequency of flooding, for the entire database. We can produce these models very, very quickly. We can show how many people have been displaced by the floods. So you get a sense of where the big problems are. We can show how quickly these floods recur in different parts of the world. So we can take an enormous data set that you couldn't really have done anything with 10 years ago. And now in a day, we can produce a series of visualizations that allow people to see things in ways that they could never see before. And what we discovered is that when people see them, first of all, it really facilitates collaboration and coordination. People can suddenly say, oh my God, I see myself in this, and I see what you're experiencing, and this becomes very, very useful. We've just released our new real-time integrated drought monitoring and prediction system. This is sort of unique because I think we may be the first people who are claiming to be able to predict extreme events in the next 6 months. And that's a period that has been really, really elusive for modelers so far. You can get a big general sense of things over a longer period of time, but to look into these shorter periods of time has been very difficult. So right now this is online on our website with the historical information. Very soon it will go live with real-time drought information. What we're basically doing is collecting data from hundreds of different sources and putting it together so that you can watch drought as it occurs around the world. I think this is going to make, we also produce, so this is an example of the flood hazard viewers, and you can look at these things and you can see that what we've been able to do, and I think this is important for collaboration and coordination, is we've developed very user-friendly viewers, and you can play with them. They're very sophisticated. They bring a lot of data together, but you can play with them. You can you can use a topographical map or a street map or whatever you're comfortable with. You can put different types of of information on top. You can play with things. It's not just a slider that allows you to see sea level rise. These are much more I would say, complex in what they're producing. But for the viewer, once you've learned a few things, you can really manipulate this information very effectively. And we can present it in ways that make sense to people. We discovered that a lot of mapping and models don't make sense to the average person. So we've been playing around with different ways of producing this so that people understand it. And they can say, now this makes sense to me. I understand these things. And people can look and say, I lived through this event, and this is exactly what happened. And so I'm more confident in your ability to predict these future events. We discovered that there are things that people really want to know. For example, where will water not drain quickly? And therefore, what can we do about it? And one thing that our modeling has disclosed repeatedly is that for an awful lot of risk management, there are efficient and low-cost solutions that are widely available, but people don't really think of until they look at this. Digging a ditch in the right place, building a stone wall in the right place can have a dramatic impact, but it may take generations to figure out what the right place is. You can now look at something like this. You can now say, what if we put a ditch in here? We're doing this around the world. People are saying, what if we do this? And then we're saying, well, there's a good chance that will divert water in a way that will be, protect the assets that you want to protect. So it's worth your effort to do that. People ask us for things that we never expected. As scientists, we want to know how quickly areas drain. What people want to know is who have to get to work on bicycle or foot. They want to know, where will there be water that I will have to encounter and deal with? So we said, wow, we never thought of that information, but we can produce the visual tool very, very quickly so that you can orient yourself and make decisions accordingly. Our maps are being used, our models are being used, our simulations are being used in all sorts of purposes. I'll give you one quick example. We discovered massive flooding so one of our sites is Los Laureles Canyon in Mexico. And it experiences massive and very, very destructive flooding. And part of that, the reason for the flooding is because trash accumulates and blocks the drainage systems. Now that trash then flows, a lot of that trash flows into the United States where the California Park Service picks it up. So we ran some models and suggested that it would be far cheaper to support trash collection in Los Laurales Canyon than pay for trash collection in California when it gets there. And the Park Service looked at the numbers and said, now all we need to do now is find a mechanism to transfer it, because it makes perfect sense to do that. That'll improve everybody's life. That'll reduce flooding in Los Laurales Canyon, improve trash collection there, and also reduce the amount of trash that flows back into the United States. And it will cost less than it's currently costing. These are the sorts of things you can do when you put all this information together in ways and allow people to creatively think about solutions. On the horizon, we're working with Imran and so on to start to think about how we can use this to improve, to reduce flood risk in refugee camps and to improve siting decisions. I've talked about our medium-term forecasting tools. We're also linking our flood models to other types of technologies, like rapid diagnostic tools that can detect certain types of pathogens in water. So as when people move into a new area and you've got this human pressure, you get all sorts of different diseases. And typically we wait until they get into the human to analyze the blood and then say, here's the course of treatment. We're now believing that we can probably use smartphone technology to do rapid diagnostics in the field and figure out, a water treatment strategy before people get sick. We're also looking at, so we're looking at all these issues. I won't go into them. But I do want to just close with a couple of comments about the links to violent conflict. As somebody who said, conflict is a I've been talking about the potential for big data modeling, visualization tools to support collaboration and coordination. I do think that what we're also worried about is that the scale of change that we're seeing, the potential for really, really a constant sort of battering by drought and flood and heat waves, does cause some alarm when we think about the ways people typically understand conflict. People understand it in terms of, root causes and the sort of perceptions of threat and catalyzing factors, whatever those might be, triggering events. And what we know is they could be events like droughts. They could be events like floods. They could be events like a water crisis in an urban setting. Certainly, there's some chain of connections between any of these things. And I take poverty and inequality as an example. To the extent that we believe that people like Collier are correct, that poverty and inequality do contribute to forms of violent conflict. And we believe that people like Piketty are correct, that though they're increasing around the world, we can speculate that extreme weather events, based on the experience we have, are deepening poverty and inequality. They're not reducing it. So that means that ultimately extreme weather events, since they're increasing and they're deepening what we believe contributes to violent conflict, we have a chain there which is difficult to prove, but which sort of makes intuitive sense, and we should be alarmed by. Therefore, the more we can do to sort of encourage collaboration and find low-cost, efficient solutions to managing these risks, the better off we are. And I think that we can use these systems that we've been developing here to do precisely that. I think that the potential of really actionable, and I think this is the key thing, this information is actionable. Instead of being these big, crude sort of visuals of climate change at a global scale, we can now do our model building in foot by foot grids if we want to. We can put millions of bits of information into very, very small grids if we want to. That becomes sort of expensive. So part of the key is finding the right size of grid. But we know one thing. It wasn't that long ago that we were using 140 kilometer by 140 kilometer grids to as the basis for our modeling, and we've shrunk that down to, in a lot of cases, we're talking about things that are probably in the meters, and they become very, very useful to people for development decisions, for flood resilient design, for mobilizing people around things like digging trenches or building berms or putting in stone walls or whatever it is, for staging resources, for optimizing humanitarian interventions. We think there's a wide range of application for this. So I'm alarmed by the trends that we see in terms of extreme events, fires, drought, and flood. I do believe that we have a tool now that we didn't have 5 or 6 years ago. And I think the more policymakers and planners are able to avail themselves of this tool, the more likely we'll be able to bend our capacity to manage risk in a positive direction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard, for showing us visually what this kind of big data can do and produce, and how those visualizations can work. As a conflict analyst, one of the things that I immediately think about when I look at this type of approach is the challenge of getting data and information in fragile and conflict-affected environments like the ones that Imran is about to talk to us about, and specifically in places like refugee and IDP camps where human mobility is part of the dynamic system that you're trying to track, as you talked about. And the challenge is also then, which increases the type of uncertainty you talked about in terms of how the landscape may change along with those human movements, et cetera. So great setup for Imran to move us into this conversation.
Good questions.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, and thank you, Richard, for those wonderful comments. And thank you also to Lauren and Congresswoman Harmon for inviting me to the Wilson Center. It's a great honor to be here and to be on such a esteemed panel with such esteemed colleagues. So thank you very much for inviting me. For the past 8 years or so, I've worked as an aid worker in humanitarian crises around the world. I'm a water engineer by training, and I'm a field researcher. I've had to clean up recently as I've moved to the university. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Sorry, it's like being in an airplane. Sometimes it doesn't work when you're tall. Yeah. My remarks today, I want to reflect both what I've seen in the field firsthand as an aid worker and the public health related research that I've been involved in over the years. I've worked mostly with the medical humanitarian organization Doctors Without Borders, or Médecins Sans Frontières in France, MSF. And I consider it part of my training, in fact. MSF has a principle of témoignage. In French means witnessing. It means advocacy. It means speaking on behalf of the populations and their plights and their stories, and giving voice to people who may not have that voice. So that's really the lens I want to bring today. It's tell a bit of the stories from the field. What I want to talk about is how deepening water scarcity around the world is pushing vulnerable, displaced people to the very limits of survivability. I want to talk about what we, as practitioners and as intellectuals with the humanitarian impulse who contribute to shaping public policy and public discourse, what we can do about this very real human and environmental security challenge today. So it's not going anywhere. Am I doing this correctly? Okay, I'll keep going until that's good. So UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, just last week released its annual Global Trends Report, and the news is not good. We're living in the midst of the greatest forced displacement crisis in human history. There are now 68.5 million people displaced around the world. That's a country the size of France that is displaced all around the world. Now, just a small portion of the world's forcibly displaced are in countries of the global north. It's the countries of the global south that carry this burden, with major displacement crises in the Middle East, the Sahel, Central Africa, and South Asia. Now, when people are displaced, the normal functioning of life falls away. Everything becomes a matter of survival. When states are too fragile, unwilling, or unable to fully respond to crises, a global humanitarian system tries to step in to preserve life, to preserve what the Italian philosopher JiaBin might call the essentials of a bare life. So people need food, they need shelter, they need medicine, they need protection. And these essentials form the clusters of humanitarian response. Water, too, is one of these essentials for life, but water cuts both ways, both when there's too much water and when there's too little. Displaced people, more than anyone else, are uniquely vulnerable to this duality in their raw exposure to the world. Now, these two photos are taken months apart in the same place in South Sudan. This region, part of the vast floodplain of the Nile, exemplifies what water means for displaced people more than any other place that I've seen. This is a map from MSF describing this emergency situation in South Sudan in 2012 and 2013. People from Blue Nile states in Sudan here were pushed into South Sudan because of ramping up of a low-intensity civil war that had gone on for generations, but really accelerated after the secession of the South in 2011. When the refugees from Blue Nile came into South Sudan, no one in the global humanitarian community knew about it. UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, sent a team up to the new border to investigate, and they found 30,000 people next to an open pond drinking the water, and that pond dropping by the day, because it was literally 20 meters by 30 meters or something like that, dropping by the day. Now, these people had been on the road for 2 months at the tail end of the dry season, so they had very little food or water along the way. They had to leave the children and elderly who were too weak to go on the road. So when they arrived inside South Sudan, they were in really, really rough shape. With water really quickly declining at that temporary site that these refugees are found, UNHCR moved fast to open a new refugee camp at the closest possible site. Now, UNHCR generally tries to establish refugee camps 50 kilometers from a border, so there's some sort of, distance from any potential border skirmishes. The first site 50 kilometers due south was a place called Jamam, and it was decided that the refugees would be settled there. Now, if it hadn't been for the urgency of the situation, the camp planners may have asked the local people what Jamam means in Maban, which is a local language. They would have told them that Jamam actually means swamp, because as soon as the rain came, a month or two after the refugees were settled there, Jamam, as it always does, became a swamp. So rainwaters flooded the latrines, causing sewage to inundate the surface, contaminate the entirety of the environment the refugees were living in. At the same time, boreholes to develop groundwater were almost impossible to develop. The soil there is clay rich, is very difficult to drill in, has very low groundwater productivity. So we had a situation in which there was water everywhere but nothing to drink, in fact. For many months of the emergency response, the water availability for the refugees lingered around 3 or 4 liters per day per person for all uses: drinking, cooking, bathing, cleaning. The minimum humanitarian standard is 20 liters per day, and that's just for the basics. So this massive environmental contamination caused by flooding, combined with the lack of clean drinking water for drinking and hygiene, caused waterborne diseases to tear through the population. At first, there were outbreaks of acute watery diarrhea, and the threat of cholera hung over the camp. And then later on, there was an outbreak of hepatitis E. Now, hepatitis E is a waterborne viral illness that we don't know much about and for which we have no cure. It has a very unusual pattern of attack. In the general population, has a case fatality rate of around 2 to 3%, but for some reason in pregnant women in their second or third trimester, that CFR jumps to 20%. And oftentimes the death of a pregnant woman in an isolation ward like this often meant 2 deaths, because the child in utero would either die or would be delivered so prematurely that it had very low chance of survival. So witnessing this was incredibly difficult for all of the humanitarian staff in the field, particularly for the medics, because there was nothing they could do medically. What this meant is that we had to break the transmission of the disease in the camp. So we work with our partners in the field to increase the level of water and sanitation, those essential services, to break the transmission of the pathogen before it got from one person to the next. That meant increasing the overall water supply, improving the water quality, doing mass hygiene and health hand washing promotions, creating a really enabling environment for environmental and domestic hygiene. After many weeks of this work, the transmission was beaten back, and the health status of the population improved. Now, what we witnessed in South Sudan was extreme, but unfortunately, it's not unique. Conflict, displacement, and water tend towards vicious spirals. First, there's displacement due to conflict, drought, or flood. Then comes hunger, famine, malnutrition, and then waterborne diseases cut through the population. That's why there's 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. They all come together. Today, humanitarians speak of the 4 famines: Yemen, Somalia, South Sudan, and northern Nigeria. In each of these places, conflict exacerbates impacts of drought and water scarcity, making people doubly vulnerable. Many of the world's forcibly displaced people are in regions that currently face extreme current water stress. Many of these same regions also face high levels of drought severity and face considerable flood threats as well. And the bad news is that under climate change, the outlook is not pretty. Current models suggests that water scarcity will be severely exacerbated around the world. The evidence of how anthropogenic climate change might affect extreme weather events is a bit more mixed. There's a paucity of data and attribution problems exist, but there does appear to be a trend, as Richard had mentioned. So when people flee, they flee because they have no other option. When to stay means you may not survive. The places that people flee to then are necessarily at the very fringes of survivability, a unit of geographic distance between living and not living. That's where the camps are. Deepening water scarcity, more frequent drought, more devastating floods will mean more forced displacement and more desperate conditions for displaced people. Water scarcity in particular threatens to push parts of the planet into becoming almost uninhabitable for human life. The displacement camps will be found at those margins. But what does it mean to build and maintain a camp where life almost cannot be sustained? What does development assistance mean when there is no more forward progress in a particular place? What this fearful situation demands of us is fearless thinking. It demands both forms of global solidarity. Refugees and forcibly displaced people will ultimately have to be resettled in parts of the planet that can actually sustain these many human lives, now and in a changing future. It means leading by example first in the global north, as some countries have barely already done, to settle their depopulated rural areas or underpopulated rural areas with people who are seeking a place to build a new life and a new home for their families. In doing so, also rejuvenating the adopted countries as well. It also means helping countries in the global south who actually host most of these populations adopt meaningful settlement and integration policies that enable freedom of movement, freedom of work, and even provide land. Like in Uganda, where hundreds of thousands of South Sudanese refugees have been given plots of land to build, farm, and build a life for their children. It means, as you know, we're all gathered here, we know the importance of investing in water and sanitation infrastructure, not just in the camps, but in the communities before the crises come, so that they're not so fragile in the face of these shocks. Now, water and sanitation interventions are a good deal. They have a great return on investment. Estimates suggest that for every $1 of water and sanitation investment yields $5 to $46 of returns and time saved, healthcare savings, and lives saved. Oops. So, you know, I just want to end on, these are what I think these are the biggest challenges of our generation and maybe the next couple of generations. And I think often of what the Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari says about the propensity of the human collective to undertake collective action. And he says the pattern in history is that people are very much capable of doing it when we're faced with a massive existential threat. And we are, in fact, faced with massive existential threats. And some people are already living that existential threat out. This is a moment now to create new forms of collective action and global solidarity in the face of these threats that will help us then take on the next ones in the generations to come. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Imran. And as we talk about collective action and collaborative efforts to address these complex challenges, we will now turn to Janani, who's going to talk about some collaboration that she's currently engaged in.
Sure. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk to you about Lake Chad. I want to try and pull together some of the threads that were picked up with our keynote speakers and the panel that's gone before me. And just give you this story of Lake Chad as an illustrative example of how water, climate change and the climate's impact on water come together with fragility, and how if we don't think about these implications and don't fully understand what they mean, there's a real risk that we're going to get the solutions wrong. But it's not as negative as that. It's more the flip side of this. If we understand this relationship, then there's a real chance that what we do will have a chance of succeeding. There's a real chance that what we do will kind of fall into that World Bank sustainability quote that we got from Richard Matthews earlier. Sorry, John Matthews. Sorry, too many Matthews on the on the panel today. So Lake Chad is an ecological miracle. It is a freshwater lake in the middle of the arid Sahara Desert. Nobody really understands why or how it exists, but it does, and it is amazing. But recently, Lake Chad has become a symbol of climate change. The stress of climate on the water table has become almost synonymous with the region in itself. It's also become synonymous with Boko Haram and the humanitarian crisis, which has left over 10 million people in urgent need of humanitarian assistance and displaced about 2.5 million people in the region. Oh, sorry. Okay. So I knew I was last on the panel, so my presentation is just photographs in case you just got bored of listening. But I thought it could go on a slideshow, but I don't know really how to do that. Yeah. Okay. Well, you can just do it arbitrarily, Amanda. So yes, it's also become this kind of poster child for climate and security. Most prominently, perhaps, just last year, in March last year, when the UN Security Council passed a resolution, the highest kind of thing that the UN Security Council can do, a resolution on Lake Chad in which it contained some of the most strong language on climate change and security so far, acknowledging this link between climate and the security risks facing the region and calling for greater risk assessment and risk management strategies. And this is great, but it also means that we need to get the risk assessment right. Because for those of you familiar with the context, you might anticipate that I'm going to talk to you about how the lake is shrinking and this depletion of the water table in this lake that feeds communities in the 4 neighboring countries in Nigeria, in Niger, Chad, and Cameroon, how this is fueling the conflict between Boko Haram and the state security forces. But I'm not. That's not the story I'm going to tell you. In fact, I'm going to tell you a very different story. The lake is actually expanding. The lake is in a period of expansion. It has been for the past 20 years. It's not a question of water scarcity. But that's not to say that water and the implications of climate aren't a key piece of this puzzle. But we need to understand what this relationship is to get the solutions right. If we go with the water scarcity, the lake is shrinking story, we get a response which could actually pose a huge threat. So there's a very strong narrative around the lake shrinking based on the only information that was available decades ago. And upon that, the solution being propounded by many actors, including the governments of the region, is to address the water scarcity. If the argument goes, lake is shrinking, that has caused this terrorist insurgency with armed opposition groups such as Boko Haram. The solution, therefore, to address the instability in the region is to refill the lake. The solution, therefore, is a multi-billion-dollar pipeline to refill the lake from the Congo Basin. That's what's being put on the table. But if we understand, using the data that we have now, that the issue is not the scarcity of water, but actually the variability. It's the variability of rainfall. The lake has always fluctuated. There have been times where it's completely arid, times where it was huge, almost the size of France, throughout its history. And people living around the lake have always adapted. But the variability in rainfall feeding the lake, both interannually, so within the year, within the rainy seasons, how much rain is falling, but also intra-annually, when the rainy season is coming, this has never varied so much in the lake's entire recorded history. And it's this uncertainty and this unpredictability that these communities are unable to cope with, given the context of fragility and insecurity that they're already dealing with. And it's if we understand this, that we can actually ensure that the solutions that we're proposing to address the humanitarian crisis, the stability situation, the infrastructure that's needed, it's only if we build in this relationship with between water and climate change and fragility that we can ensure that peace is climate proof, essentially. So I'll set out 4 risks that we've found in the 2-year study that we've undertaken, which illustrate the ways in which climate, water, and fragility have come together. And I hope these will help illustrate some of the points that have come up earlier in terms of these dynamics and understanding how water is part of these kind of vectors of fragility, and how it therefore needs to also be part of the solution. So essentially, Lake Chad is, I think you spoke, Imran, about this vicious circle. Lake Chad is indeed caught in this conflict trap. And water and climate are a really important piece of this, and a core part of the solution. We identified these 4 risks. The first is around livelihoods. This variability in rainfall that I mentioned, this is meaning that the historical coping mechanism that people have always had, diverse livelihoods. It's a lake, people fish, but people do not, or historically have not just practiced single sectoral livelihoods. They have had multiple livelihoods. So you fish during the rainy season, during the dry season, the lake recedes, hugely fertile soil for recession farming and agriculture, may also keep animals and livestock. But because of the variability of the rains, people don't know when to switch from fishing to farming. If they're farming, they don't know when to switch from one crop to the other crop, depending on the season. So this has really reduced the diversity that they can turn to in terms of livelihoods, and this is undermining their resilience to cope with climate shocks. But it's also really affecting social resilience. It's also undermining social cohesion. This is a hugely ethnically diverse region. And we have seen, as a result of this stress on livelihoods, pressures and grievances and violent conflicts as well, at all levels of society, within the household through to between different identity groups. It's also leading to maladaptation. It's leading to people resorting to what are called negative coping mechanisms. Deforestation as a livelihood source for charcoal, crime, criminality, prostitution, and sex work, and also recruitment into armed, or becoming more susceptible to recruitment into armed opposition groups, and I'll pick that up in a moment. The second risk linked to this is natural resource conflict. So this is linked to livelihoods, but the region has always experienced natural resource conflicts. Natural resources here being essentially water and land. So land for pasture and farming use, and water for fishing, for irrigation, for agriculture, and for livestock. In a region where land rights are incredibly unclear, they're based on traditional norms, and in fact the historical memory of who has access to land or who has have rights to use the land sometimes rest in just a single person, then it's not codified anywhere. And in this humanitarian crisis, sometimes these people are no longer there. They have to move, or they might be killed. And so those land rights, the clarity on land rights disappears too. And an interesting trend is that with the stress on water, not just because of the variability of the rainfall, but also because of the conflict, meaning that there's real pressure on land and water, because huge areas of the lake shores are now restricted. So the security forces, state security forces, have restricted access of the population to huge swathes of the shoreline and the islands. There's lots of islands in the lake for security reasons. And so people have had to evacuate those regions, and that means a lot less land that they can use for their livelihoods. And also the conflict. So some places are just hot zones. They cannot go there because the conflict is too severe. And so this really is compounding the pressure on resources and leading to increased conflicts. An interesting dynamic here is that when the conflict between state security forces and armed opposition groups was very high, there was actually a reduction in natural resource conflicts, because I guess there was a greater threat to security. But in the regions where the terrorist threat has been stabilized, there's actually been a resurgence in natural resource conflicts, because whilst one threat's been kind of suppressed, there's now space for these historical grievances to come about. And these grievances have been compounded because of the context. So the point here, the interesting and relevant point here, is that whilst all eyes are on stabilization vis-a-vis the armed opposition group crisis, as that starts to, or if that is then stabilized, there are, if you're not really understanding the dynamics at play, there's a real risk that there won't be adequate attention given to these new conflicts or crises that are emerging around natural resource stresses. The third risk is around recruitment and retention into armed opposition groups. So I mentioned this when I talked about livelihoods. As people's livelihoods become less viable, people are looking for alternatives. And I think somebody mentioned that there isn't that much research on this, but there is a growing body of evidence, and it is harder to understand the causes, the drivers of why people join armed opposition groups. But there have been some quite solid studies interviewing ex-combatants, and yes, this is livelihood stress is one of the drivers, as well as the lack of services and the lack of kind of hope that people have in their current situation. But another trend here is that people are also returning. So people that have left armed opposition groups for various reasons are actually, there's an increased trend in them returning because the alternatives are so bleak. So in our last trip, we in Maiduguri in northeastern Nigeria, we heard from a young girl who was so relieved that her brother and her elder sister had returned from Boko Haram because they just couldn't cope with the violence anymore. They had joined for ideological reasons, but they hadn't anticipated the violence and the killing. So they had returned to their village, but faced with the prospects of what life had in store for them in the village, they went back because they had then the option again of food, of paid work, and of services like education. And this is something that really is a trend that is increasing. And it's important here to understand that people have joined for various reasons, and it varies across the country. So in Nigeria, it's maybe more ideological. But in Niger, the primary reason is actually economic. So whilst we might think of this as a kind of ideological conflict, it's really important to understand the economic drivers here as well. And what we're also seeing is that there's a lot of investment in stabilization, in reintegration of ex-combatants, but these are not climate-proof. People are being reintegrated into livelihoods that are no longer viable, not even in the future, but also at this moment now. And the fourth stress is around over-militarized solutions. So I said that this is a crisis region, and a lot of investment isn't around climate resilience or water management. It's in stabilization. And there's a real risk that some of these strategies are actually fueling the risks and leading to greater recruitment into armed opposition groups. So the militaries in the region are actually supported by the international community. There's something called the Multinational Joint Task Force, and that is the four-country regional stabilization entity. And they adopted something of a scorched earth policy in many regions, which were perceived to be kind of Boko Haram areas, which really undermine the resilience of those communities that live there. If you just said, you cannot farm here, these are military restricted areas, you can't live on these islands anymore. This has really undermined people's resilience and has fueled grievances. And so speaking to a number of people, there's a very strong sense of resentment and revenge, the need to kind of avenge these decisions that have undermined people's lives and livelihoods, that is kind of becoming a driver of recruitment in and of itself. So there are four risks through which I think the context and the water and climate risks come together. And if we understand these drivers and understand these nuances, there are bright spots. I know I've kind of focused on the negative, but there are bright spots, because if we understand how these interact, there's a stronger chance of getting the solutions right. At the moment, I mean, I'm really trying in the study to identify entry points and identify some of these bright spots that can be replicated. But there aren't that many, because there's a real perception here that it's a humanitarian crisis. It's a conflict that needs to be stabilized, and then we think about climate change. But actually what we're seeing is that the humanitarian responses are undermining climate resilience. People are getting food aid because there was a huge risk of famine a couple of years ago, but they weren't receiving fuel. And so people were then deforesting the surrounding regions to cook the food that WFP and the FAO were giving them, which was then fueling the soil degradation and land erosion and contributing to desertification and affecting their climate resilience. They are, the stabilization measures are reintegrating, as I mentioned, reintegrating people into regions that are not viable, or into livelihoods that are not climate proof. So if we understand these dynamics of how water and climate interact with the drivers of conflict, but also how they're a key part of the path to peace, then there's a real chance that we can, if we climate proof this pathway to peace, that we can get to a sustainable solution to the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janani. I want to appreciate Lauren for putting the panel together in the order that she did, because starting with Scott's high-level overview of kind of where we are in global analytics, et cetera, all the way down to Janani talking about very localized specific dynamics in the Lake Chad region, I managed to hear a story between all of you that I wanted to just put out there as a starting point, because I get to be the moderator and therefore I get to ask questions and talk first. So I appreciated in Scott's presentation, he made a really important point at the outset that there are different types and aspects of conflict that we should be focusing on in this conversation. It is not all about violent conflict. It's about understanding political conflict, social conflict, economic conflict, and how that's tied to water security issues. And I think that's a really helpful frame for us to start with. And as Richard talked about data and visualizing systems, I think you really helped us actually literally see the system in which these water security challenges are living. And when you see that and you bring it down to these very specific components that you described of, for example, where can a pedestrian cross the street, you actually begin to find very specific opportunities to engage that system. And you start to see that a flood is not a monolithic event, that there are all these different pathways where it disrupts parts of the system, and therefore there are opportunities to engage with that and to change the outcome to one that is less destructive, hopefully. Imran very helpfully brought in the perspective of human mobility and the importance of considering that in both these planning tools and the analytics and the solution finding, most importantly. It really shows the dynamism of all of these systems. The people that are involved in these systems are not staying put one way or the other, whether it's refugees and IDPs or whether it's bankers and business owners in Old Town Alexandria affected by floods. People have to respond and they have to move. And capturing that type of dynamism in our understanding of both the problem and not only the solutions, but how people are going to adapt and how that's going to modify the possibilities for solutions is incredibly important. And then last, Janani opened her presentation with a very profound and important part of this issue, which is get the risk assessment right. And we don't do that a lot of the time. Harkening back to Scott's original presentation as well, I think you pointed out, Janani, in the case of Lake Chad, that it is not only a problem of scarcity. There are very important issues around quality and access. And the way that people perceive their own risks and the way that they respond to those risks is going to be critical to finding the opportunities to engage. And if we don't presume what the problems are, but rather we go in understanding that these are very complex, dynamic, and emergent systems that we're trying to understand, we get to the point that all four of you raised. All of you said, okay, I'm about to present a really bad news story, but I see there's an opportunity here, or I'm going to tell you about the positive side of this, right? None of you believe that these are problems that we can't try to tackle constructively. All of you see that there are bright spots, that there are ways for the development community, the diplomatic community, the defense community, the practitioner community to break this problem apart into pieces and to start to find the right solutions. And as Janani really highlighted, I think it's also very important that because we're sitting in a room filled with people who are focused on water in one way or another, that we remember that the solutions are, first of all, not always technological or technocratic, and they don't always lie in the sector where you started. So when you can think in this more holistic, systems-based way, you begin to find creative opportunities. So that's where we're headed with this conversation. And I had a question that I wanted to pose to you all. It's really around early warning. And all of you in different ways also talked about our improvements in knowledge and data and information and our ability to grapple with that information and then share it with the people who need to use it in different ways. So we clearly need more and better information in order to get our risk assessments right. That is an ongoing challenge. But from where I sit, one of at least an equally important challenge is figuring out how to apply those early warning analytics. And in the space that we're talking about today, that largely means we're applying it in order to achieve prevention. And when we are trying to measure and attribute things around prevention, hope you all could hear what I was saying the last 4 minutes. Or maybe I'm glad that you didn't, I don't know. Right, so when we're trying to get a desired outcome of prevention, it's really hard to measure and attribute whether you got to the thing that didn't happen. And that makes it really hard to prioritize resources, energy, and money for those interventions. So if you look at Richard's maps and visuals, you can probably convince a lot of policymakers who control budgets that there are really big problems. But then when you get to designing responses, whether those are actual programs, policies, institutional changes, to get us as human beings to prioritize those responses for outcomes that are kind of hard to measure and attribute, that's tricky. So I wonder, from all 4 of your respective experiences, could you share any insights about where you have seen early warning analytics applied in ways that really made a difference, just to give us a sense of kind of where that opportunity might best lie? And that's to any of you.
I could start with an example. Not really an example of where it was applied, but where it could have been applied. In our last mission to Niger, we were in a harbour town called Guité, and this is in southern Niger, and they told us about the harbour. So historically it had been a really thriving fishing village. Because of the conflict since 2009, things had really taken a hit. But in 2014, they decided to invest in the harbour and to actually build some infrastructure, build a physical building, a structure to store fish. And in that same year, in 2014, the harbour and the physical building to store fish were washed away because of floods. And this was really, this was a devastating blow to this community, because it is a very, very poor community. And there was so much hope invested in this to rekindle the economy and get it thriving again. It could have been prevented because, as I mentioned, the lake shore fluctuates hugely, and there is data on, and all they needed is data on the minimum and maximum expansion parameters of the lake, which is available. And then they could have, based on this, taken a calculated risk. They don't want it too far from the lakeshore because it's a harbour and they need it close, or the fish need to be processed near to the shore, but they also don't want it too close. So had they had this information and a little bit of guidance on how to where to situate this infrastructure, this could have been prevented. And the challenge there is that despite freely available satellite data and really solid data on the kind of expansion patterns of the lake shore, there's just so little governance and outreach. These communities are so isolated that they weren't receiving information. What could be done, though, is to use the very broad radio networks that connect the communities, and you make use of the regional lake management body, the Lake Chad Basin Commission in this case, to better kind of communicate this or help people access this information. So sometimes the information isn't there, but sometimes it is, and it's then just a case of how to deliver it to the people that need it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to say, I think that the broad trends are alarming. That is that around the world, people are still moving into very vulnerable areas at a very quick rate, especially coastal areas, where they're moving in at 2 to 4 times the rate of interior areas, even though they know that the big storms and the big floods and so on take place there. A lot of people there's a lot of investment and development in areas where people believe hardened defenses are protecting them, even though we have lots of evidence that defense systems typically fail, and they're failing more and more. So people are moving into areas where they are going to experience massive, and they're often taken by surprise. And it's not just Houston; it's around the entire planet that they're being taken by surprise. We did a study in Thailand that showed that when people had timely information that they trusted, they experienced far less damage than people who did not. So we know that early warning systems probably work really well. Our own experience with our own models is that once we develop them, they do take some time to work with the community to gain its trust to develop. People then start to take a different perspective on risk and the relationship to it and what they can do about it. And so we get local communities asking us questions like, okay, how should we grade this road? Or would it make sense for us to do this? Or, they're talking about paving this. What will happen? So we start to see that people begin to manage their risk because they feel that there's a sort of, that they have the capacity to manage that risk. So these tools give them that capacity. They know that something's going to happen, but now they start to feel, well, we can do a lot of things about that. So I think that we've been very pleased in places like Mexico and Paraguay with the community response to these sorts of models. And we know that when people have this capability and they get information that's timely and appropriate, they are better off. But I think that the broad global trend suggests that people are making a lot of decisions that will increase their vulnerability in the next couple of decades. So even though I think we have some very powerful tools, I think that it wouldn't be, you wouldn't lose money betting that there's going to be a lot more disaster and humanitarian crisis in the next 30 years.
Did you want to go ahead? I just sort of wanted to maybe pick up on a related point. So I think obviously data is extremely important. It's extremely difficult to get good data. That I think is still much, much easier than getting institutions to the point where they can use it effectively and really do something meaningful with it. And I think if I were to sort of boil down what I think from a political point of view is interesting, important, concerning about water is that it's uniquely easy to manipulate it for political purposes. It just doesn't have the resonance. Water just has this resonance that is unlike minerals or fish or something like that. I think the only thing that compares to it is land, and the implication of that is that unless you have really strong institutions that manage water that are able to kind of make decisions about who uses it, even when you do have good data, and that data is disseminated, available, unless you have institutions that are really kind of have some degree of legitimacy and some capacity to use it, it doesn't get you as far as you need to get. So I might just sort of emphasize that point, and maybe one sort of slight other, which is I think that it's also important to realize that given that situation, different institutions will need different types of data, or different types of data will be more useful to them. I thought the example of having street level kind of inundation maps, it was a really good one and a really helpful one in saying, well, this is a lot more useful if you're showing up to a planning meeting. People can sort of see, oh my gosh, my street up to my part of the block, is going to be inundated, that's a lot more effective. So I think it's also critical to say not just always more data, but of the right kind and for the right institution.
I was really racking my brain, Cynthia, to think about where have I seen early warning really work. And because I work in the humanitarian sector, I often come in after something's already happened. So, and I can think of tons of examples where, people thought something really terrible would happen and mobilize massive amounts of resources to build water and shelter and get food in position for tens of thousands of people, then only a few hundred people came. And then 3 months later, once everything was pulled back, then they came. So I see the other side of it a lot. But it got me reflecting on this question about how do you know you prevented something? How do you prove a negative? And that's a really salient question for something like water and public health, right? Like how do you prove that you prevented that diarrheal disease, right? It's very hard to prove. And there's been a big move in development to try to build a more rigorous evidence base, and that's important. But the tendency has been to rely on the tools we use in clinical settings, like randomized control trials, to prove public health outcomes, which are very difficult to implement. There are ethical problems, particularly in emergencies, of trying to see what kind of water treatment system works or doesn't work, deprive a population of it. So for me, it raises questions about what is good enough evidence so we can make decisions. Does it require an RCT? Is that the gold standard? Certain things we know work, and we know from experience that if we don't provide them, like water in a refugee camp, there'll be massively devastating consequences. So that's just a reflection I had on that, the question of evidence and how do we prove a negative. Yeah.
Great. That was very helpful. Thank you. I am now going to open up this amazing brain trust to the audience, and there are loads of questions. So why don't we take maybe 2 or 3 questions at a time? And for those of you who are going to ask the questions, let's start with the gentleman over here on the left. Kindly provide your name, your affiliation, and let us know if your question is for a specific panelist or for the whole panel.
I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV, and really it's across the whole panel, and this was an excellent presentation. But you look at all these tools that are being developed among the 4 of you and many others, but yet you see the magnitude of the negative impacts because of the dramatic change at a very rapid rate of the climate across the globe. So how do we do this in real time? Because we're beyond the stage of where, next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, as in most governments will want to do, will plan for this. We need to react almost in real time. And how do you mesh that together with public policy that is longer term? And then like the conflict areas you're talking about, Lake Chad, where you have military forces competing with, local terrorist groups, and yet you still have established norms through local governments and provincial governments. I mean, this is really something that's very complex, but the Earth and the climate slipping away from us. How do we do this in real time? And thank you for being here.
Thank you. Let's move first to the gentleman in the way back, and then we'll hop up front to Chris.
My name is Lance King. Hi, my name is Lance King. I've done consulting work with nonprofits in 6 African countries as well as domestically. And in the conflict area, and this was mentioned very briefly, there are increasing relationships to environmental issues and water, and particularly in the experiences that I go back to as a Californian, you look at things like the efforts to protect endangered species and control over water distribution to agriculture or for drinking water. And you have large-scale systems like the Hetch Hetchy Dam, which has supplied San Francisco. So there are, in African countries that I have experience with, endangered species issues that come up. And some of these relate directly to climate change, and where you have more extensive drought. In California, where you have 7 years of drought in the high Sierras, and the snowpack provides 2/3 of the water supply to California. Government agencies have big challenges if you're going to protect salmon, for instance. I've heard discussion of dams and hydro. There are places in Africa where answers are not necessarily, and in other countries, the kinds of things that we talk about with hydro, but perhaps more decentralized. And for instance, something as simple as solar panels pumping water to a hospital, and along the way with the pipes, there are spigots so that women have access to water and don't have to spend half the day going and collecting water, and those kinds of things. And I don't know whether in the research that some of you are doing, whether you're looking at more of these decentralized systems. One of the criticisms of the World Bank in the past has been that they tend to look at some of these large-scale systems, and some of those really, with hydro, for instance, in China, have been very devastating and displaced large numbers of people. So I'm wondering if any of you have really looked at some of those more decentralized kinds of systems and environmental impacts in displacing large numbers of people, those sorts of environmental issues as well.
Thank you. Could someone get a mic up here to Chris?
Thank you. My name is Chris Holmes, and I work with the Boston Consulting Group, and I serve as their Global Water Security Advisor. And I'm just curious your observations on the shifts in groundwater. You know, there's been so much attention with the recent GRACE reports dealing with terrestrial water storage and disturbing indications of some pretty profound changes as it relates to Western India and the high plains in China. And that most certainly appears to be not cyclical, but potentially permanent. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, let's give the panelists a chance to answer these. How do we do this analysis in real time and match that with long-term policy agendas? The interconnection of all of these issues, from endangered species, drought, dams, hydro, environmental impacts, and decentralization approaches. And the last, Chris's question around groundwater. Who would like to jump in first? Scott.
Okay, I'll try to be quick, but there were a lot of meat, of course, in those in those questions. I think I'll maybe say a little bit about the question about decentralization and whether there are good alternatives to kind of infrastructure models, to big infrastructure models. And I'll just start with a quick point on the California example that you referenced, because I wrote something for the LA Times a couple weeks ago. And I think it's an important example because it's a pretty good illustration of conflict between an environmental objective, namely the maintenance of minimum stream flow in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta to preserve some endangered fish species that are regulated under the under the Endangered Species Act. And extreme pressure from farmers who have been through a lot in California in the last few years, who are very hesitant to understand why these regulations preserve those stream flows, at least in the way that they do. And in a further good illustration of how this becomes very easily kind of it can be manipulated for political purposes. The President of the United States over the last couple of months has made a number of statements about things like, well, why is California letting good water flow into the Pacific Ocean? Well, it's to preserve the Delta smelt. But because there aren't good institutions in place to support those types of decision-making processes, it's a regulatory action from Washington, essentially, simplifying a little bit. There's just not good popular support for that. And I think that gets to the bigger question about whether there's a better way to do kind of water planning and water infrastructure development. I do think we don't think enough about the question, not just of can we adopt a decentralized solution or a nature-based solution, but do we really need to build these big mega projects at all? Sometimes the answer is definitely yes, but I think we don't often ask the question honestly enough to where the answer may be no, and that's for political economy reasons that I think we can all guess at. big infrastructure projects, politicians like them. They do tend to be good, at least in the short run, for economic development. So I think it's a political economy problem instead of just being an economic or an environmental problem. I'll just say also quickly about groundwater. You know, this is an issue where I think a lot of it depends on your adaptive capacity in terms of institutions, in terms of technology, and in terms of money. So for China, I'm really not concerned about groundwater depletion there, because China has effectively plumbed its national hydrology with the South-North water transfer and some associated diversions. On top of that, they have the money to adopt all sorts of technological solutions to potential water scarcity. But if you look at India, those conditions aren't in place, and I think the impact on the economy could be much more severe.
I'd be happy to jump on this and say, I think that in terms of our understanding of water challenges, and the data and information we have available, we're in a good space. I think we're also able to customize that data and provide appropriate knowledge very quickly. I would say from our perspective, the gap between what we know and what we need to do and our governing institutions is become quite long. So somehow, and I don't think it's any surprise around the world, political systems are experiencing gridlock and loss of and losing the confidence of the public and so on. And in California, we know that the current sediment management systems, for example, don't work. And what's at risk are the beaches and salt marshes along the entire coastline. We also know that the dredging schedules don't make sense in light of current information and understanding. But to change the system, where we have a group of sediment managers that we consult with, it could take 20 years to get the information that we have to lead to actual change on the ground. That's far too long. We'll lose the beaches and salt marshes before that happens. So when we look at the alternatives, we're doing a study of private-public partnerships in the water sector, and the failure rate is remarkably high, and especially in fragile states. It's not good in developed states, but it's really, really bad in fragile states. So we have to think carefully about private-public partnerships as the road forward. Philanthropy, I think, in spite of the bold proclamations of philanthropists, it is a drop in the bucket of need, and often moves us along some personal trajectory which makes no sense. Decentralized approaches, here our experience is inequality is an important factor here. So decentralized approaches in rich areas we're seeing very, very effective. And across California, little rich areas have become very, very resistant and resilient in the face of fire, flood, drought, these sorts of things. In poor areas, it's a mixed bag. There certainly some of these tools can help people develop efficient, low-cost mechanisms. But on the whole, I would say the rich are doing very well in terms of resilience, and the rest of the world not so well, and the government isn't helping them. I think that visualization tools are important in helping us see those trade-offs between protecting this species and doing this and doing that. So I think they can be very useful and can enrich the debate and discussion. But I do think if we don't close the governance gap in some way, if we don't find some solution to that, it's hard to imagine a really positive future over the next couple of decades.
May I jump in?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to reflect on something you said, Richard, about decentralized systems. So some of my doctoral work was looking at decentralized alternatives for water supply in slums, pejoratively, in South Asia, because there was a lot of movement towards household water treatment or community-level systems at the time, and there still is. I've cooled on that a little bit. And the reason is what I saw happening was the local government was very happy for us to do this, because it meant that they no longer had to deal with safe water supply in a slum. They can just get rid of it. And you think about the trajectory of the expansion of safe water supply and sanitation in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, in parts of East Asia. These were massive public projects. It wasn't an atomized delivery of one service at one time. There's been a massive study recently that showed that when we break down WASH services into single interventions, they're not that effective for improving public health. It has to be a whole package delivered at once to break all the possible pathways of pathogenic transmission. So yeah, decentralized approaches, if they're atomized, it won't deliver the public health good that we're after. And then therefore all the economic and social and downstream impacts from there. I want to reflect also on Chris's provocation about groundwater, and it's nice to see you again, Chris, after some years. Yeah, in certain regions of the world, the levels of groundwater are dropping, and that's because of overexploitation or because of lack of recharge or multiple factors. So quantities are declining. That has clear public health implications. The other thing that's changing is quality. As you drop deeper and deeper, you're getting into more and more mineralized water with higher levels of salts, minerals, electrolytes in the water. What does it mean for an individual's health or a population's health if you drink water with an elevated level of sodium or sulfates or nitrates over the course of your lifetime? We don't know yet. These problems are emerging. I'm actually leading a project right now looking at this issue of chemical water quality on some of the most vulnerable patients and populations, severely acutely malnourished children in humanitarian crises. Their physiology is so devastated by the malnutrition that they're super susceptible to imbalances of electrolytes in the water. And we see more and more that water and food insecurity overlap. So these malnourished children are sort of, unfortunately, the canaries in the coal mine. They suffer first. But what they suffer will be extended to the rest of the population as these problems get worse and worse. So we need to react now for those canaries to save the rest of us as well.
Thank you. The question about how do we feed this analysis into real time? You're right, absolutely. We can't sit around and conduct these multi-year studies before we can do anything. But I think there is a lot that can be done. I think the point was made earlier about this new shift from top-down to bottom-up approaches. I think if that's your starting point, then a lot of the analysis is already there. The users of these resources have a very nuanced understanding of what their needs are, and I think that's part of it. And that links to this also to the point you made as well, Cynthia, about how do you show impact on something that may not happen. If we do take this approach, we can also start doing something by shifting the focus to resilience, not so much how do we prevent something, but if you're building resilience, you're kind of moving towards those no regrets policies that if you do or you don't face that risk, there is still some resilience has been built, and we're shifting how we're measuring it. We're not measuring it against a counterfactual that is oftentimes impossible, but we're actually measuring it against a framework like the SDGs, where you're actually just moving ahead on a kind of a development agenda, and that might sound a little bit wishy-washy, but there are studies that have shown that this can be effective, and it can help also donors understand how to see value for money differently in their water or conflict or climate change programming. Another point was flexibility, that there is so much complexity, uncertainty built into the system that even with the analysis that we might get after a 3 or 5 year study, we still don't know whether those models can be accurate because there is so much built-in uncertainty. So if we build in the ability to be flexible, then we're able to make at least take some steps in the right direction. And the other point was about institutions. Very often it's not the analysis, the information that we need, but the institutions that have the capacity and the legitimacy to act upon this. So even if we don't have perfect information, we can actually do a lot through investing in institutions, and that speaks to the decentralization issue of, yes, it's great to have these decentralized approaches. If I go back to Lake Chad, the reason for the conflict, the reason for the rise of the insurgency was decades of marginalization by the national governments in these really remote areas. Absolutely no service provision. It's not weak governance, it's no governance. So now there is an effort to invest in strengthening the capacity of the local governors and the local institutions, which also ensures that kind of feeds back into that bottom-up approaches part that I started with.
Thank you. We'll give Richard the last word, and then we'll go back to the crowd. I know there are lots.
Just one other thought on this. I've worked on a number of humanitarian missions where you're very focused on providing relief from suffering. But you don't necessarily look at the big picture of things. As an academic, we look at the big picture of things, but the incentives of a university are not built around making the world a better place. They're built around getting published in certain types of journals. And I wonder how often the incentive systems in various institutions that we're all part of mitigate against really channeling our time towards making the world a better place and serving the public good. I imagine that everybody would like to do that, but the incentive structures pull us in a different direction day after day after day. And I certainly feel that very much in the university system.
Thank you. More questions? How about straight in the middle in the back, and then almost directly in the middle of the room?
Thank you. Nick Kosar, Ibtian TV, UK. When do you think and consider mass migration from rural areas to the slums alarming? For instance, in the last 5 years, the number of people living in marginal areas in Iran has risen from 12 million to 19 million, mostly because of lack of water and resources. And we're seeing some sort of conflicts. Is that a myth? Considered what we're seeing, or nothing would happen in the future to these people?
Thank you. Could we bring the microphone to the gentleman in the exact middle of the room?
Hi, my name is Greg Rulifson. I'm with the Colorado School of Mines Humanitarian Engineering Program. And my question is actually particularly for Imran, but I think for everybody around engineers and trusting engineers. So just very simply, who trusts engineers too much and who trusts them too little, and how do we kind of navigate that? My background's also in civil engineering in California. All these things are coming together. I really appreciate y'all being here. Thank you.
Thank you. And could we bring a microphone up here to the lady in the blue jacket?
Karen Florini with Climate Central, which is a climate science analysis and communications organization, not an advocacy group. Question for each of the panelists. To what extent have you, in your work, taken into account the regrettable fact that the NASA digital elevation model is grossly inaccurate? Climate Central is well aware of this because we've actually created a more accurate one, and the errors are measured not in inches but in multiples of feet, which means that for particularly for developing countries, the coastal digital elevations that are assumed to be correct are much lower than, are much higher than is actually the case. So there's much worse problem than is currently recognized.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and take one more. Right behind her.
Brian Bruns, consulting sociologist who works on water governance. And firstly, for Jana Vivekananda, if you can talk some more about bright spots or paths to peace in terms of resilient livelihoods that offer opportunities for, particularly young, poor women and men in rural areas in Lake Chad or other parts of the Sahel. But this also links the issue of how you go from humanitarian aid to, sustainable or resilient development, and how you have information institutions for that. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, let's let the panelists have a crack. First question for everyone, mass migration. Second question, Imran plus anyone else. Should we trust engineers? Third, inaccuracy of models. And fourth, for Janani and others, bright spots. Mass migration, go.
There's this very strong narrative on migration being the key vector for climate conflict, and I think it's quite a harmful narrative. I know I keep on speaking about Lake Chad, but it's just in my head today. Here, there was huge amounts of displacement, and the majority of people are not in IDP camps. They are in host communities, and this has been absorbed with such hospitality and very little conflict. So it's not the migration in and of itself. I think where it becomes alarming is where there is inadequate governance to cope with the additional strain on resources. So it's, resilience isn't about the stress on resources in and of itself. It's how it's governed. And I think where those institutions are too weak, or sometimes incomers are used, can be politicized as an excuse for why governance providers are not able to provide these basic services. Oh, because these people are putting this undue strain on resources. So I think it becomes alarming, not because of the migration and the displacement, but because of the governance capacity. Bright spots. I was really worried someone would ask me this, but no, there are. I mentioned the stress on fuel wood and how that's contributing to deforestation as a result of the humanitarian response. But when you look, I think one of the pictures on my slides was a canoe going through. It was just a sea of green. That was the lake, and a plant that grows very well in the lake called Tifa. And people are deforesting trees around settlements, but actually this is a really untapped resource. Tifa is being used in other parts of the region as a biofuel, and it's just not being used in this region. And that's an example of a livelihood and an alternative fuel that can be adopted. Similarly, there is a lot of spirulina, which is a high value and high nutrition product, which is not climate dependent, and there's real potential there, but there's just there is no market, or a very small domestic market, but globally, there is a huge market and growing market. I live in Berlin, and this is a very hipster region, and everybody's drinking spirulina smoothies in the mornings. If only they could be tapped into this market in Lake Chad. So there are. I mean, I could go on. Oh, one other example is polders. This is something that the Dutch are incredibly proud of. I was told by a Dutch colleague that they're especially proud of polders because only 2 Dutch words really made it into the English language popular usage. Did I tell you this already, Lauren? One is polders. The other is apartheid. So they're really, really keen when people talk about polders. Polders are it's a method of farming, kind of dredging or building a barrage on a water body and then creating land in this kind of fertile zone. And this works really well around the Lake Chad Basin, but it needs to be done in a conflict-sensitive way. I mentioned that there are no clear land rights. If you're creating a real high-value asset, which is arable, highly fertile land from something where it didn't exist, if you're not thinking about who has access, who can use this, and who benefits from the crops, you're creating a risk of conflict. So there is real potential, but it has to be done in a conflict-sensitive way. I could go on, but we can maybe talk over lunch. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I would say that the based on current sort of trends, it's conceivable that urban space will double over the course of this century. That's a massive expansion, almost all of it unregulated, almost all of it extremely vulnerable to the sorts of things we're talking about. So we should be concerned. There is a massive movement, and that movement is driven by all sorts of factors. The environment is one of them, but we should be worried about the rapid expansion of sort of unregulated urban space that doesn't have adequate amenities and is putting people in the front lines of flood and other types of risk. I think that that's a problem that we ought to be able to manage better. I think that in some places, I know that places like Jordan are overwhelmed right now by the number of people that have moved into them. So those systems are simply being overwhelmed, and what they're dealing with is unbelievable given the small amount of support the world is providing. I see the world increasingly sort of not building bridges, but circling the wagons and building walls and trying to manage things this way. I think that's probably a big mistake. I think that the global picture, population moving around is probably a good thing. It's an adaptive strategy. It probably makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways. But right now, I think it's it's problematic. There's at least 100 million people homeless in the world, and probably 3 or 4 billion who are in unstable housing in the world. So this is a huge, and that includes a large part of California, for example, who are living in unstable housing conditions. So we have a big issue there. I think it's a huge one. In terms of trusting engineers and the models and so on that they produce, models are far from perfect. We improve them constantly. They have to be constantly recalibrated. They embody uncertainties. We make decisions. We use all sorts of techniques like Bayesian techniques to try and reduce the amount of uncertainty in our models and to deal with a world that is full of uncertainty. But you have to not be naive. These are not perfect predictive tools that say this is what's going to happen. These are just tools that are part of that can be helpful in a variety of ways, as long as you also have some sense of their limits and the limitations. I think that increasingly we're seeing something positive in the world of engineering as people start to frame engineers as vital sort of parts of the solutions going forward. The sort of challenges that we have need engineers, and they need to be thinking about things like social justice and inclusiveness and those sorts of things. And that's why we're seeing fields like development engineering take shape, which are bringing people together who are trying to solve social problems, not just make a smarter smartphone or something like this. So I think that they're an important part going ahead. I don't know. I don't think the world trusts anybody these days, and probably rightly so. But we work with a lot of engineers.
So let me respond first to the question about urban slums and migration. Slums are the refugee camps of the future. They're the refugee camps now. In fact, more and more we're seeing displacement not going to traditional, well-planned camps in rural areas, which is a model that the entire humanitarian system is built around for the past 30, 40 years. We're seeing them go into these unregulated spaces, informal communities that are very exposed to multiple sorts of hazards. And all the means and methods, tools, and approaches we have as humanitarian responders are completely ill-adapted and ill-suited for response in those areas. So this is actually what we're undertaking now, is trying to do research on figuring out how do we respond to humanitarian crises that are now in urban areas, mixed in with populations, mixed in with host populations. And it's a huge gap, and it's an area of intense activity right now. On the question of engineers, should we trust them? I would say yes. I'm biased, clearly. Listen, I think the problem is that there's a humanitarian engineering program at CSM. That's fantastic. Engineers and scientists, people want to make the world a better place. That's why they go into this work. I think that the where we fall down is communication. The things that we deal with are super complex. How do we communicate uncertainty? How do we communicate confidence in our predictions, our models? We're not very good at that. Maybe it's just really hard to do, but that's really where we need to emphasize our energy. It's not just the techniques, but the communication. How do we actually translate that to policy? And that's the next piece, is that scientists and engineers, we get really focused into our technical details. And we forget the landscape, the political environment that we inhabit. So we cede that space of policy and decision-making to others who maybe have a less scientific approach, right? So that's on us to actually step up and say, we're really good at the techniques, let's also be good at the communication, at the politics, at making things real. And let's enter into that political arena and start pushing back against these really anti-scientific and really detrimental kinds of narratives that aren't going to help us get where we need to go. So the point well taken. Thank you for that question.
And Scott.
I'll just say very briefly in response to the question about Iran, because I think what that does bring up, and it strikes me maybe we didn't sort of cover this point as much as perhaps we should have in this panel, that all kind of incidences of water crisis are not created equal, and there are definitely some countries and regions where it's much more concerning than others. I think, broadly speaking, you can think of, well, if you have a country or region that has some combination of water scarcity, poverty, instability, conflict, lack of cheap energy, incidentally, for better or worse, then you can solve a lot of water problems with cheap energy. But if you have some combination of those factors, that's really where you should be most concerned. And I think Iran falls, somewhere in that nexus or somewhere on that map. But the countries that would probably be most concerning are places like Yemen. I've done a little bit of work there previously at the World Bank, and we did some work there we're able to get some data on what's happened to water use since the onset of the Civil War, well, the most recent phase of the Civil War, where you've had lots of had the Saudi and Emirati involvement. And basically what's happened is the municipal water supply has totally collapsed. People now rely on tanker truck delivery that just comes from unregulated wells. And because it's all just totally unregulated, totally sort of left to individual actors at each stage of the process, that's the key vector for the spread of cholera. So you get this kind of really nasty combination of instability, active conflict, and a breakdown in the sort of water supply system and health systems. And so I think if we're kind of thinking about where to go next, where to sort of focus our efforts, it is important to kind of triage a little bit, I think, where we should be most concerned and focus our resources. And I think the global water strategy that we talked a little bit about earlier does do that. But I think we ought to be even more intently focused on that type of risk assessment going forward.
Thank you. Lauren, do we have time for more questions? Or? No, we do not. Okay. Thank you to our panelists. Let's start with that. Really dynamic conversation, and I, for one, appreciate it very much. As we try to maybe distill a few lessons from the conversation around the emerging trends that are going to affect water conflict and cooperation in the future, maybe we can keep a few things in mind from this panel as we move forward to the other panels. The first I would suggest is that we don't presuppose the problem and we get our risk assessments right, recognizing the systems in which these water-related challenges are embedded. The second, which came out very strongly in a lot of your answers in the question and answer period, was around the importance of institutions and governance, not just government, but governance systems. And I would advocate that we also really keep in mind that many of the places where we're talking about these challenges and these crises coming together are affected specifically by conflict and fragility. So we really need to have a conflict-sensitive lens around the conversation and our understanding of the institutions and the governance mechanisms that we are dealing with and talking about in our solution finding. And the last is that we really account for adaptive capacity and strive to promote resilience to these water-related shocks and stresses, recognizing that we won't be perfectly predictive no matter how much knowledge we ever have. And as these systems are changing and evolving, there is possibility for adaptation, there is possibility for building resilience, even in part at the same time that other stresses may be magnified. So I'd ask us to hold on to at least those three things. And I appreciate all of the panelists and their contributions. Thank you to the audience for remaining so engaged. You've been sitting in these chairs for a long time. And now you will be rewarded with networking and lunching and having great conversation. Lauren, do you have any direction?
So thank you. That was wonderful. A lot of food for thought, and now we need some real food. So we'll have some lunch available right across the hall. In the there's a small room. There'll be a buffet set up. You can walk through the buffet and then go into our dining room and have a seat and enjoy each other and the food. The restrooms are at the end of the hall, and we'll reconvene here in about 1 hour. Thank you so much.